He grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks. That was the moment Serena Vale understood that her husband had never seen her as a person. Not once. Not even now, with her 7 months pregnant and struggling to keep her balance on the marble staircase, his fingers digging into her skin like she was something he owned and had temporarily misplaced. "You don't leave this house," Victor Rains said. His voice was quiet. That was always the worst sign when Victor stopped raising his voice. "Tonight, not without my permission." Serena looked at him. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. "Let go of my wrist, Victor." He did, but only because one of his guards had appeared at the top of the stairs, and even Victor Rains understood the optics of a man his size gripping a pregnant woman in front of witnesses. If you've ever stood in a room where you realized the person you trusted most had never actually known you, all this story is for you. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you stories that will shake you, move you, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Give this video a like if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The night Victor Rains married Serena Vale, 3 of his closest advisors told him he was making a mistake. Not because she was dangerous, because she was, in their words, nobody. No family name worth mentioning. No connections to the underworld. No leverage, no alliances, no financial portfolio that would benefit the organization. She was a woman who had appeared in Victor's life 18 months earlier through a chain of coincidences. He'd never chain of coincidences. Introduced at a private event by a man whose name Victor barely remembered, employed at the time as a consultant for a boutique risk management firm that handled, among other things, financial compliance for corporations that preferred not to be scrutinized too closely. Victor had found her interesting. He was not accustomed to finding women interesting beyond the obvious. Serena Vale sat across from him at a dinner table and asked him, completely without performance, what he was actually afraid of. Nobody asked Victor Rains that, not his advisors, not his rivals, not the men who had worked alongside him for a decade. He had laughed. Then he had thought about the question for 3 days. By the time he decided he wanted to marry her, his advisors had already conducted their background investigation and returned with a verdict that should have prompted questions, but instead produced only relief. Serena Vale was clean. No criminal connections, no debt, no hidden allegiances. She was, for all practical purposes, exactly what she appeared to be, a self-possessed woman from an unremarkable background who had built a quiet professional life through intelligence and discipline. Victor heard this and felt satisfied. He should have asked what they hadn't found. He should have wondered why a woman that composed, that perceptive, that completely without fear in his presence, had no record of anything at all. He didn't. He proposed 6 weeks later. The marriage had lasted 14 months before it started to corrode from the inside. Not publicly. Never publicly. Victor Rains did not permit disorder in visible places. But inside the mansion, behind the iron gates and the armed perimeter and the rotating security detail that never slept, the silence between husband and wife had taken on weight and texture. Serena had stopped asking him questions. That was the first sign, though Victor hadn't registered it as such. He had noticed only that the dinner conversations had become shorter, that she no longer initiated discussions about anything that required his opinion, that she had reorganized her daily schedule in ways that kept her out of the rooms he occupied most frequently. He told himself this was pregnancy fatigue. He told himself women became withdrawn and interior in their 3rd trimester. He had no actual knowledge to support this belief. He had simply decided it was true because the alternative required him to examine his own behavior. The alternative required him to remember the night, 4 months ago, when he had come home at 2 a.m. and found her sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold and an expression on her face that he had never seen before. Not sadness, not anger. Something quieter and more final than both. "Where were you?" she had asked. "Working. Were you?" It wasn't a question. That was the thing that had unsettled him, not the words, but the absence of interrogation behind them. Like she already knew. Like she was giving him the opportunity to say something true and had already accepted that he wouldn't. He had walked past her and gone to bed. In the morning she had made breakfast and asked about his schedule for the week, and the night before had apparently ceased to exist. Victor had chosen to interpret this as forgiveness. By the time Serena was 7 months pregnant, the mansion had divided itself into territories without anyone formally declaring the boundary. Victor occupied the east wing, his office, his private meeting rooms, the balcony that overlooked the iron gate and the long driveway. Serena had claimed the west the library, the room she had converted into a nursery, the smaller sitting room where she spent her evenings with a book open in her lap and her phone face down on the table beside her. The guards knew the arrangement. They rotated between the wings without comment. This was the kind of domestic geography that the people who worked for Victor Reigns learned to navigate without acknowledgement, the same way they had learned to work around his temper, his surveillance habits, his requirement that every door in the mansion remain unlocked, except the ones he personally chose to seal. Control was Victor's native language. He had been fluent in it since he was 19 years old and had first understood that the world would take from you everything you failed to hold tightly enough. The irony, the one he would not fully appreciate until much later, was that his grip had driven away the one person who had never planned to leave. The trouble with Marcus Vale started, as trouble often does with trusted men, with something small. Marcus had been Victor's financial director for 11 years. He was 53 years old, methodical to the point of compulsion, and possessed of the specific kind of loyalty that functions perfectly until the moment it doesn't. Victor trusted him not because Marcus had ever demonstrated particular warmth or devotion, but because Marcus had never made an error Victor could detect, and in Victor's accounting, the absence of visible failure was the closest thing to virtue. It was Marcus who had restructured the organization's offshore holdings 4 years ago. Marcus, who had negotiated the shell company arrangements that kept Victor's name 3 layers removed from anything actionable. Marcus, who kept the ledgers in order, and the audits predictable, and the money moving in patterns too complex for outside examination, but immediately legible to anyone with the access codes. Marcus had those codes. He had carried them for 11 years. And approximately 18 months ago, around the time Serena Vale first appeared at a private event, and asked Victor what he was actually afraid of, Marcus Vale had begun, quietly and with extraordinary patience, to use them. Serena found the first discrepancy by accident. She had not gone looking for it. That was what made the discovery so difficult to dismiss. She couldn't tell herself she had been paranoid, couldn't retroactively construct a narrative in which she had suspected something and gone digging. She had simply been in Victor's office on a Tuesday afternoon, waiting for him to return a call, and had picked up a quarterly summary from the desk because it was the closest thing to read, and her eyes had snagged on a number that didn't correspond to the figure in the parallel document sitting 2 inches to its right. The difference was not large. $400,000, distributed across 6 subsidiary accounts in a way that would require 3 separate cross-references to confirm. Most people would have missed it. Serena had spent 6 years in financial compliance before Victor Reigns had ever sat across a table from her, and her brain processed numerical inconsistencies the way other people processed misspellings automatically, involuntarily, without being asked. She put the documents back exactly as she found them. She said nothing to Victor when he returned. That night, she lay in the dark beside her sleeping husband and thought very carefully about what finding that number actually meant. Not just the theft she had understood within 40 minutes of her initial discovery that someone with internal access was systematically extracting funds from Victor's organization. What she turned over in the dark, slowly and with methodical attention, was the question of why. Because people who stole from Victor Reigns did not simply want money. They wanted out from under him, and people who wanted out from under Victor Reigns required a plan that addressed the problem of Victor Reigns himself. She placed her hand on her stomach in the dark. She understood then that the threat was not only to her husband. What followed were 4 months that Serena Vale would later describe to no one, because there was no one she could describe them to without explaining things that could not be explained in the order she was willing to explain them. She began with access. Victor's network of internal documents was secured, but not impenetrable, not to someone who had spent years understanding how organizations protect their financial records, and, more importantly, where the gaps in that protection tend to appear. She was methodical. She was slow. She took nothing that couldn't be attributed to the random archival behavior of a pregnant woman, with too much time and not enough to occupy herself. She built the file over 16 weeks. It was not small. Financial records, correspondence trails, timestamp transfers, a series of photographs she had obtained through a contact she had not spoken to in nearly 3 years. A contact whose existence she had never shared with Victor, because Victor had never asked about the years, before they met with any real curiosity, and Serena had never volunteered information that wasn't requested. The photographs were the most damaging. They documented 4 meetings between Marcus Vale and 2 men, whose names appeared nowhere in Victor's organizational records, but whose faces appeared in sealed federal case files that Serena had no legal access to and had obtained through means that she did not examine too closely, because examining them too closely would have required her to answer questions about herself that she preferred to leave unanswered. She stored everything in a physical format. No cloud backup, no encrypted server. A single drive, kept in a place that required knowing the architecture of the West Wing in intimate detail, which meant requiring the kind of access that only someone who lived in the mansion and had spent months quietly mapping its interior would possess. She had almost contacted Victor directly. Twice, she had sat with the drive in her hand and thought about walking to his office and placing it on his desk and watching his face as he understood. Both times she had stopped herself, because both times she had remembered the night at the kitchen table, cup of tea, his footsteps going past her without slowing. If she brought him the evidence, Victor would take it, and he would handle it, and she would be exactly what she had always been in his estimation. A woman who had stumbled onto something useful. A fortunate accident. Not a person who had spent 4 months systematically protecting him from a threat he was too arrogant to detect himself. She needed him to understand what she had done. She needed witnesses. Malcolm Creed returned Serena's call on a Thursday morning, which was 14 months after the last time they had spoken, and 7 months after Serena had left a message through a channel that most people didn't know existed. "You waited a while to reach out," he said. "I was handling things. Are you still handling things? Or do you need actual help?" Serena was sitting in the nursery she had decorated herself, her hands wrapped around a mug, her back to the door. "I need you to come," she said, with the others. "I need it to look like what it actually is." There was a silence on the other end of the line. "How much does your husband know about you?" Malcolm asked. "Nothing," Serena said. "That's partly my fault. But it's mostly his." Another silence. "Then how far along are you?" 7 months. "Serena, I know what I'm asking. You're asking 6 men to walk into the home of Victor Rains." "I'm asking 6 men to walk into my home," she said. "That's different." Malcolm Creed was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Serena thought the line had dropped. Then he exhaled the particular exhale she remembered from years ago, the one that meant he had already decided but wanted a moment to register his objection before setting it aside. "What time?" he said. Victor was on the balcony at 2 a.m. when the first car appeared on the long driveway. He watched it with the particular stillness of a man who has trained himself never to look startled, even when he is. Then the second car appeared, then the third, all black. No plates visible from his angle. His hand moved to his phone. Devlin, his head of security, picked up on the first ring. 3 vehicles on the approach, Victor said. "Why are my gates open?" Pause. "Sir, the gate code was entered correctly. The system registered it as authorized entry." Victor looked down at the driveway. The cars had stopped. 6 men were getting out identical black suits, unhurried, moving with the specific kind of calm that isn't casualness but discipline. The calm of men who have assessed the situation and determined they are not in danger. That was the detail that stopped Victor's hand over his phone. Not 6 strangers entering his property at 2 a.m. 6 strangers who had entered and were not reaching for anything. "Nobody moves," Victor said into the phone. "You hear me? Nobody reaches for anything until I'm downstairs." He was already moving before he finished the sentence. He took the main staircase at pace and arrived at the ground floor in time to hear, rather than see, the front door open. He had not unlocked the front door. He turned the corner into the entrance hall and stopped. Serena was standing at the bottom of the main staircase. She was wearing a dark blue robe, her dark hair loose, her hands at her sides. Her posture was completely composed, the kind of composed that isn't achieved in the moment, but carried in from somewhere else, like she had spent time preparing for this specific arrangement of herself in this specific room. The 6 men had formed a line behind her, not surrounding her. Behind her, like a formation, like a statement. Victor looked at his wife, and then he looked at the men, and then he looked at his wife again. He was searching for fear on her face, because fear would have been familiar. Fear was something he understood how to read and how to use. There was no fear, Serena. His voice came out controlled. He was proud of that. "What is this?" She looked up at him from the bottom of the stairs, not like she was looking up at someone who had authority over her, like she was looking at a problem she had already worked through the solution to and was now simply implementing. "You should have asked who I was," she said, "before you married me." The silence in the entrance hall was total. Victor's eyes moved to the man at the center of the six, taller than the others, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the face of someone who had spent considerable time in places that required the kind of calm he was currently displaying. The man looked at Victor with an expression that was not hostile and not apologetic. It was the expression of a man delivering information. "My name is Malcolm Creed," the man said. "We're not here to threaten you, Mr. Rains. We're here because she asked us to come." "Who are you?" Victor said. "Right now? We're the six people standing behind your wife." Malcolm's voice was even. "What we've been in the past is complicated. But tonight it's simple." Victor descended 3 steps. His hands were loose at his sides. He was working very hard to project the version of himself that had made people afraid for 15 years. "You entered my property without permission." "She gave permission," Malcolm said. She has authority over her own home." Malcolm's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. "And Mr. Rains, with respect, this is the part where you decide whether tonight ends badly or ends with you understanding something important. That choice is yours. But I'd encourage you to take a moment before you make it." Victor looked at Serena. She had not moved. She had not flinched when he descended the stairs. She stood exactly where she had been standing, and her eyes were on him, with an expression he was only now, in this moment, beginning to accurately name. It was not contempt. It was not cold. It was patience that had reached its edge. "Seal every exit," Victor said, not taking his eyes off his wife. He said it into the air, knowing Devlin was on the earpiece, knowing the order was already being transmitted to the perimeter team. "Nobody leaves, Victor." Serena's voice was quiet. "Think about what you're doing." "I'm containing a security breach in my own house." Panicking. The word hit him wrong. Not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. And she'd said it without cruelty, the way you'd note a factual error in a document. He felt heat move up the back of his neck. "You brought 6 strangers into my... I brought 6 people into my home," she said. "There's a difference, and you know there's a difference, and I need you to be smart right now instead of angry." One of his guards had appeared at the far end of the hallway. Then another. Victor felt the geometry of the room shift in his favor. His people outnumbered the 6 men by at least 3-1, and his people were armed, and the 6 men in black suits were, as far as he could determine, carrying nothing. And yet the 6 men were not afraid. That fact kept landing wrong. Malcolm took a step forward. Not toward Victor, toward the dining room table that sat at the periphery of the entrance hall, an antique piece that Serena had chosen and that Victor had never paid attention to. Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket. Every guard in the hallway tensed. Malcolm placed something on the table. Small metal. Caught the light. A key. Old silver, worn at the edges, the kind of key that didn't fit modern locks. Victor stared at it. "There's a vault," Malcolm said, "that you believe was destroyed in the Martin Avenue fire 6 years ago. The records from that vault, you assumed they were gone. They weren't. They were removed before the fire, which means the fire was set to make you believe a specific set of records no longer existed." He paused. "They exist. Copies of them are in a file that Serena has been building for the last 4 months. The originals are secured off-site. What's on that key will open a secondary location where documentation is stored documentation that concerns your current financial structure, your current advisory team, and a timeline of events that begins approximately 18 months ago." Victor had not moved. 18 months ago, he repeated. "Give or take," Malcolm said. "Around the time Serena entered your life. Which, for the record, is not a coincidence, though, perhaps not in the way you're currently thinking." Victor looked at his wife. Serena met his eyes. She didn't look away. She didn't look guilty. She looked tired genuinely, physically tired in the way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and is finally, cautiously, setting it down. "How long have you known?" Victor said. 4 months, she said, "since I found the first discrepancy. And you didn't come to me. Came to you every night," she said. "You were there. You just weren't present." The silence that followed was a different kind from the one before, less like a held breath and more like a door standing open. Victor picked up the key. It was lighter than he expected. He turned it over in his palm. On the reverse side, stamped into the metal, was a sequence of numbers. He recognized a reference code from a filing system he had used in the early years of the organization, before he'd modernized the record architecture. A system that only 3 people had ever fully understood. 2 of those people were dead. The third was Marcus Vale. Victor's jaw tightened. Marcus, he said. It wasn't a question. Marcus, Serena confirmed. And 2 others you'll recognize. And one you won't, which is the one you should be most concerned about. Victor looked at her for a long moment. His hand closed around the key. You built this file yourself, he said. Yes. Over 4 months. Yes, while pregnant. I was pregnant, not incapacitated. Something moved across his face that was too quick to be read cleanly. Not quite shame, not quite awe. Something that hadn't had occasion to surface in a very long time. Why didn't you just take the evidence and leave? He said. You had enough to go wherever you wanted. Buy your way to somewhere safe. Why stay? Serena looked at him for a moment before she answered. When she spoke, her voice was flat and honest in equal measure. Because it's my home too. And because the threat wasn't only to you. Her hand moved to her stomach, briefly without drama. To both of us. Victor looked at the key in his palm. Then he looked at Malcolm Creed. Tell me everything, he said. It took 40 minutes and 3 separate documents. Malcolm walked him through it without embellishment, without the kind of theatrical gravity that lesser men use to inflate information. He was direct and precise and waited without impatience when Victor stopped to examine a page more closely or ask a clarifying question. The scale of it was worse than Victor had anticipated. Marcus Vale had not acted alone. He had recruited 2 of Victor's senior advisors, men who had attended the wedding, men who had shaken Victor's hand at the hospital when he'd received the pregnancy news, men who had sat across from him in meetings and looked him in the eye for months while systematically positioning their extraction route. The financial theft was real, but it wasn't the primary objective. The money was operational funding. The objective was the organization itself. The plan, as Malcolm laid it out from Serena's documentation, was elegant in its patience. Destabilize Victor's financial position over 18 months. Create internal uncertainty by seeding doubt about Victor's judgment among the lower operational ranks, and time the final move to coincide with a period of maximum personal vulnerability, which, to the people who had planned it, meant the months immediately surrounding the birth of his child, when Victor's attention would be fractured and his decision-making compromised by factors they had correctly identified as unpredictable. They had intended to move against him during a window they expected to open in approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Victor set down the document and did not speak for a moment. The photographs, he said finally. The 2 men in the external meetings. Federal assets, Malcolm said. Or former federal assets, more accurately. Operating outside sanctioned channels. They had their own reasons for wanting the transition of your organization into other hands. The new management would have been cooperative with certain ongoing interests in ways that you have not been. Marcus was working with federal operatives, Victor said. Former, Malcolm repeated. The distinction matters legally. It does not matter practically. Victor stood. He walked to the window that faced the east side of the property, his side. The grounds were lit by the security lighting, still and quiet. His guards were at their positions. His property looked exactly as it always looked. From the outside, he turned back to the room. 6 men in black suits, arranged behind his pregnant wife. His pregnant wife, who had spent 4 months quietly dismantling a threat he hadn't known existed, using skills he had never asked her about, through connections he had never known she had. Malcolm, Victor said. What's your relationship to my wife? Malcolm looked at Serena, a question silently asked. Tell him, Serena said. 3 years before you met her, Malcolm said. Serena was working a compliance audit for a company in Altman province. The audit uncovered something that wasn't supposed to be uncovered: money, moving through channels that connected back to an operation my team was running. Covert operation. One that would have been compromised if her audit report had gone forward as written. He paused. We made contact with her to discuss the situation. We expected a negotiation. What we got was Serena sitting across a table from me and explaining, in detail, exactly what she had found, exactly why it mattered, and exactly what she proposed to do with it that would allow our operation to continue without compromising the financial compliance trail. Another pause. Proposal was correct. It was better than anything we had developed internally. We implemented it. And 6 months later, the operation went sideways in a way none of us anticipated. We lost 4 men in an ambush in circumstances that should have been survivable. Serena identified the leak inside our own structure, identified it before our own security apparatus did, through observation alone, and communicated the information in time for 2 of those 4 men to be redirected away from the ambush site. Malcolm's voice had taken on a quality that was almost careful. She saved 2 of my people without being asked, without any obligation, without any benefit to herself beyond the fact that she had identified an injustice and chose to act on it. The room was quiet. She had no training for that kind of situation, Malcolm continued. She had judgment, which in my experience is rarer. Victor was looking at his wife. Serena was looking at the floor. Not with shame, he understood that now, with the particular discomfort of someone who does not like being described and is enduring it. You never told me, Victor said. His voice was different than it had been at the top of the staircase, stripped of something. The anger had not left, but it had lost its target. You never asked, Serena said. I should have asked. She looked up. I know you should have, she said. But knowing that now and having known it 14 months ago are 2 different things. The lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a partial failure. Every light in the mansion, simultaneously, went dark. In the 1 second of absolute blackness, before the emergency lighting stuttered on dim, red-tinted, barely enough to navigate by Victor, heard 3 sounds in rapid sequence. The sharp crack of something hitting the north wall, the low thud of what he recognized as a breaching charge, and Malcolm Creed's voice, calm as still water, saying, "They moved the timeline." "East corridor," Victor said, already moving. "Emergency access, there's a secondary room off the main gallery. Reinforced walls, 1 entry point." "We know it," Malcolm said. Victor stopped for 1 step. "You know it." "Serena showed us the floor plan," Malcolm said, and kept moving. Victor grabbed Serena's arm not the way he had grabbed it earlier on the stairs, not with ownership or command. Something that had no practiced name. She didn't pull away. She moved with him. 1 hand on the wall for orientation in the red-tinged dark, her breathing controlled in the specific way. He was realizing she did everything. Deliberately, with preparation she hadn't announced. They moved through the mansion together. Through rooms Victor had walked 1,000 times and had never once walked through with her at his side. And in the noise and the dark and the sounds of his guards, beginning to respond to the breach on the north perimeter, Victor Raines understood, without ceremony, without a moment he could later point to as definitive, that he had misread everything. Not Serena. Everything. He had spent 15 years building a structure designed to protect himself. He had fortified the walls and armed the perimeter and trusted the men inside, because they had never visibly failed him, and he had never once looked at the architecture of his own assumptions and asked whether the danger was outside the wall or behind it. He had never asked his wife who she was. He had never asked because he had already decided. They reached the reinforced room at the end of the east gallery. Malcolm's people took positions on either side of the entry. Victor pulled the door and held it for Serena, a small thing, an automatic thing, but she noticed. She went through first. He followed. And in the dim red emergency light, with the sounds of the confrontation building, somewhere in the north wing of the mansion he had built into a fortress, and had nearly lost to the men he'd trusted most, Victor Raines stood next to his wife and held the silver key in his closed fist and did not say anything. Neither did she, but she didn't move away from him. That was something. He was beginning to understand, more than he had earned. The emergency lighting in the reinforced room pulsed at the rhythm of something wrong. Not quite steady, not quite failing, just uncertain enough to make every face in the room look like a version of itself that hadn't slept. Serena sat on the edge of the single wooden chair in the corner, not because she needed to sit, because standing required energy she was redistributing to other calculations. Victor stood at the door with his hand flat against it, feeling for vibration. Old habit. He'd learned it from a man who'd been dead for 12 years. Press your palm to the surface. Feel the structure tell you what your ears might miss. The door told him. Distant impact. North perimeter. Still contained. For now, Malcolm was on the phone. Or trying to be. He pulled it from his ear after 4 seconds and looked at the screen with the flat expression of a man who had anticipated this particular development. "Jamming," he said. "Localized or full property?" Victor said, not turning from the door. "Full property. They brought hardware." "That's not a spontaneous response." Victor turned. They had this planned before tonight. Before Serena made her move. He looked at Malcolm directly. "They knew you were coming." "Possibly," Malcolm said. "Not possibly." Victor's voice was tight but controlled. 6 men in black suits entering my gate at 2 in the morning is not something you hide from surveillance that's been watching this property. They saw you arrive. They interpreted it as the hand being played, and they moved. Malcolm didn't argue. He nodded once, which was the most concession a man like Malcolm Creed typically offered. One of Malcolm's men, the one Serena had addressed as earlier as Rourke, short and wide-shouldered with hands that looked structurally different from most people's hands, had taken a position at the room's single high window. He wasn't looking out. He was listening to the exterior through the gap in the frame, his eyes closed, his head tilted at an angle. 4 entry teams, Rourke said. North breach is the loudest, but it's the distraction. East wall has movement slower, quieter. 2, maybe 3. The east wall is where the generator access is, Victor said. Rourke opened his eyes and looked at him. I know. They take the generator. The secondary lighting fails. The electronic locks on the lower level cycle to default open, and the holding rooms in the basement become accessible. Victor finished. He wasn't saying it for information. He was saying it because he needed to hear the sequence out loud to confirm the threat model in his own mind. Serena said from the chair, "There are people in the basement holding rooms." Victor looked at her. 3 people, she said. I don't know who they are. I've seen food being brought down twice a week for the last 6 weeks. I didn't ask because I knew you'd tell me it wasn't my concern. The room went quiet in a particular way. Victor didn't look away from her. You've known for 6 weeks. I've observed for 6 weeks, she said. There's a difference. Serena Victor. Her voice was patient and inflexible in equal parts. If those people down there are witnesses, if they're being held because they know something that relates to what Marcus has been building, then the people coming through your east wall aren't just trying to kill you. They're trying to retrieve evidence, or eliminate it. She stood up from the chair. Slowly, with the particular physical deliberateness of someone 7 months pregnant, navigating urgency without the option of moving fast. Which means we need to know who's in that basement before they do. Victor looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Malcolm. She's right, Malcolm said, with the tone of a man who was not particularly surprised to be saying it. I know she's right, Victor said. He pulled the door. The basement access was through the east corridor, which was the wrong direction given the movement Rourke had reported at the east wall. Victor knew this. He also knew there was no other route down that didn't require crossing the main hall, which was currently the most exposed square footage in the mansion. Chose the east corridor. Devlin intercepted them 30 feet from the basement door. Devlin was Victor's head of security, 41 years old, former military in a way he'd never fully specified, with the kind of face that defaulted to neutral regardless of what was happening around it. He had been with Victor for 7 years. He was one of 3 men in the organization whom Victor had never had reason to doubt. He was breathing hard. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. North team is holding, he said, falling into step. We've got 2 men down non-fatal, both mobile. East wall breach is being attempted, but whoever they sent to that side is operating quietly, which means trained, which means... I know what it means, Victor said. The basement. Who's down there? Devlin's step faltered. Just slightly. Just enough. Victor stopped walking. Devlin. I need to finish the perimeter update. Devlin. Victor's voice had gone to a register that people who worked for him had learned to treat like a physical warning. Low, unhurried. Who's in my basement? Devlin stopped. He turned. His face had done something complicated the neutral had cracked along one specific line, the way good plaster cracks, along a seam that's been under pressure for longer than it looks. 2 witnesses from the Carver account audit, he said, and one of Marcus's men who was picked up trying to move documentation off-site 3 weeks ago. Victor was silent. Marcus asked me to hold them, Devlin said. He said it was on your orders. He stopped. He had my what? Victor said. Devlin looked at the floor. 1 second. Then back up. He had your signature on a holding authorization. Checked the format. It matched. He forged it, Victor said. Devlin's jaw moved. I checked the format, he repeated, and there was something in the repetition that was neither defense nor excuse. It was the sound of a man who had done due diligence within the parameters of what he believed was real and was now sitting with the knowledge that those parameters had been constructed for him. How long have you been holding them? Serena asked. Devlin looked at her. He hadn't, Victor noticed, been looking at her since he intercepted them. Weeks, are they? She paused. Are they all right? They're alive, Devlin said. That's not what I asked. They're alive, and they haven't been physically harmed, Devlin said. That's all I can tell you. Serena nodded once. She looked at Victor. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Victor looked at Devlin for a long moment. Long enough that Devlin's breathing changed not to fear, exactly, to the braced quality of a man waiting for a verdict. Get them out, Victor said. Right now. Use the service exit on the south side. It doesn't run on the main generator circuit. Get them off this property and contact Almeida. He pulled a phone from his jacket, not his primary phone, a secondary that he'd carried for 12 years and had used exactly 4 times. He held it out. Almeida's number is the third contact. Tell him Victor called in the marker. He'll know what it means. Devlin took the phone. He hesitated for 1 beat. Victor. I know, Victor said. Go. Devlin went. Malcolm, who had observed this entire exchange from 3 steps back, said nothing. One of his other men had taken Rourke's position at the exterior, tracking the east wall breach by sound. Malcolm simply waited. Your head of security held 3 people in your basement for 6 weeks, on forged documentation, Malcolm said, when Devlin was out of earshot. Not an accusation. Apparently, Victor said. He didn't check the signature against a second source. No. Because he trusted Marcus's authority. Because Marcus has been my financial director for 11 years and has never given anyone a reason to question his documentation. Victor started moving again toward the basement door, which is exactly what someone would engineer if they were building toward this. Malcolm walked with him. You're not angry at Devlin. I'm furious at Devlin, Victor said. I'll deal with it when people aren't breaching my east wall. That's a relatively sophisticated response to a relatively significant betrayal. I've had a complicated night, Victor said. I'm conserving. The basement was cooler than the rest of the mansion, deliberately, one of Victor's early security designs, on the theory that certain kinds of record storage benefited from controlled temperatures. The holding space had been built into the original architecture as a contingency, used twice in 15 years for legitimate organizational purposes, and had now apparently been converted by Marcus Vale into a private detention facility using Victor's own property and his forged name. Victor stood in the doorway of the first holding room and looked at the 2 people inside, a man and a woman, both in their late 30s. They had been provided with cots and water and a dim overhead light. They were not restrained. They were not visibly injured. They looked at Victor with the specific expression of people who have been uncertain for 6 weeks whether the man who walked through their door would be the last person they ever saw. You're the Carver account auditors, Victor said. The man said nothing. The woman said we were. Your audit found something. It found several things, the woman said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be, none of which we were allowed to report. We were picked up before we could file, by Marcus Vale, by men who said they worked for you. Victor absorbed this. I didn't send them. The woman looked at him with the expression of someone who has been lied to enough times to have developed a functional system for evaluating statements in real time. No, she said after a moment. I don't think you did. I'm getting you out of here, Victor said. My head of security is coming back for you in 2 minutes. You're going to leave through the south exit and contact a man named Almeida. From that point, you're under a protection arrangement that has nothing to do with my organization. Understand? The woman nodded. The man who had not spoken said, the documentation we compiled. Copies were made before we were picked up. Victor looked at him. They're with a third party, the man said. Someone not connected to your organization or to any of the structures Marcus Vale controls. If anything happens to us, nothing is going to happen to you, Victor said. He heard distantly the sound of something impacting the east wall, closer than before. But I want to know where those copies are. The man looked at the woman. The woman looked at Victor. She was measuring something. When we're off this property, she said, and when we've confirmed the man named Almeida is who you say he is, we'll make contact. That's fair, Victor said. He turned to leave and nearly walked into Serena, who had followed him down and had been standing just behind his left shoulder for the entirety of the conversation. He hadn't heard her. He was not accustomed to not hearing people. She looked up at him. They were close enough that looking up was necessary. You handled that well, she said quietly. Don't, he said. Don't what? Don't manage me, he said. Not right now. I can't, he stopped, exhaled. I need to stay focused. She didn't look wounded. She didn't look chastened. She looked briefly, like she understood something about him that she'd been waiting to have confirmed. Okay, she said. They went back upstairs. The east wall breach happened at 3:11 a.m. Victor heard it before his guards radioed it in a muffled concussive sound, distinctive, the kind that meant a professional breaching charge, rather than improvised entry. 2 of Malcolm's men moved without instruction to the east corridor junction. Rourke reappeared from somewhere with an expression that communicated advanced readiness and not much else. They're in, Rourke said. How many? Malcolm said. 3 entered, at least one on overwatch outside. Victor pulled Serena back from the corridor entrance. Not roughly, firmly, with a hand at her elbow that communicated one specific thing: stay here. And this time it's not about control. It's about the physics of what happens in narrow corridors when trained people are moving fast. She read it correctly. She stayed. The next 4 minutes were the kind of 4 minutes that can't be accurately recalled afterward by anyone who lives through them. Victor knew this from experience. Violence in enclosed spaces compresses time in a way that makes individual moments impossible to sequence properly in memory. What he retained afterward was a series of images without clean transitions between them. A man in black tactical gear coming around the East Corridor junction faster than expected and meeting Rourke, who was not where the man had anticipated, which created a collision rather than an engagement, which ended very quickly and not in the tactical team's favor. His own hands, doing things his body had not done in 4 years and remembered without being asked. A second breach team member, shorter than the first, who got further into the mansion than the others and made it as far as the antechamber, outside the library, Serena's library. The room she'd spent 14 months making habitable before being stopped by 2 of Victor's guards, working in the practiced coordination of people who have drilled a scenario many times. A third team member who turned out not to be a threat in the immediate sense, because he had been given faulty intelligence about the internal layout and had spent the 4 minutes taking a route that brought him, bewilderingly, the laundry facility on the west side of the ground floor, where he encountered no one and had the opportunity to reconsider his choices. When it was over, which was not dramatic, which was not cinematic, which was simply the moment when the noise stopped and no new sounds arrived to replace it, Victor was standing in the East Corridor with blood on his right hand that wasn't his, and the silver key still in his jacket pocket, and the acute physical awareness of his own breathing. He checked the corridor. He went back to Serena. She looked at his hand. She didn't react visibly, not with horror, not with the particular kind of theatrical distress he had half expected and half dreaded. She looked at his hand, and then she looked at his face, and then she said, "Are you hurt?" "No." "Sit down for a second." "I don't need to, Victor." She said his name the way she said most things, without raising her voice, without negotiation built in. "Sit down for a second." He sat. The floor of the East Corridor, his back to the wall, the same wall that had taken the breach charge 20 minutes ago and had held. He sat there because she'd asked him to, and he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical events of the night, and the tiredness was heavy enough that sitting felt less like compliance and more like relief. Serena lowered herself to the floor beside him, slowly, carefully, with one hand braced on the wall. She made a sound that was half effort and half frustration, the sound of a body that was accommodating a large secondary presence and finding the logistics occasionally irritating. He almost reached out to help her. He stopped himself because he didn't know if she wanted that. She settled. She sat with her back to the wall and her legs extended in front of her and her hands in her lap, and they were quiet for a moment in the damaged East Corridor of a house that was still standing. "The man who organized the breach team," Victor said. "That wasn't Marcus." "No," Malcolm said. He was standing 3 feet away, watching the corridor. "Marcus doesn't operate. He architects. Someone else ran this tonight. The man Serena's file describes as the unknown contact," Victor said. "The one connected to the external financial interests." "That's my read," Malcolm said. "So Marcus gave the order, but he's not on site." "Marcus is almost certainly not within 3 miles of this property right now," Malcolm said. "He's the kind of man who builds the mechanism and then stands well back when it runs." Victor thought about Marcus Vale. About 11 years of quarterly reports and audits and offshore restructuring, and careful, methodical competence. About the man who had attended his wedding and shaken his hand at the hospital and looked him in the eye across 100 tables. "He was patient," Victor said. "He was," Malcolm agreed. "He built this over 18 months. Longer, possibly. 18 months is when the financial movements started. The structural planning started earlier." Malcolm paused. "The Martin Avenue vault fire was 6 years ago." Victor looked up at him. "He's been building toward this for at least 6 years, Malcolm said. "The fire was step 1. He needed those records gone because they contained documentation of the original organizational ownership structures documentation that would have made it much harder to redirect ownership in the transition he was engineering. He burned the vault," Victor said, 6 years ago. "While I was..." He stopped. "While you were at the hospital," Malcolm said. "The night your father died." The corridor was very quiet. Victor closed his hand around the key in his jacket pocket without taking it out. He felt the worn edges of it. Old silver, old numbers, old architecture. He waited until I was away from the property, Victor said. He's been waiting for the right moments since the beginning, Malcolm said. He understands your patterns. He understands when you're available and when you're distracted. He has used that understanding consistently. And 3 weeks from now, Victor said. Was going to be the final moment, Malcolm said. Yes. Victor looked at Serena. She was looking at the wall across from her, not avoiding his gaze, just looking at the wall, the way people look at things when their mind is somewhere else, and their body is keeping watch in the interim. You built the file knowing the timeline, he said. I built the file knowing there was a timeline, she said. I didn't know the specific date until Malcolm's team identified the pattern in the financial movement. The acceleration in the last 6 weeks of extraction, that's what dated it. You shared the documentation with Malcolm before you showed it to me. She looked at him then, directly. Yes, she said. The word sat between them. Because you needed witnesses, he said. Because I needed people who couldn't be pressured by you, she said. If I came to you alone, with a file, in this house you would have taken it. And I would have been exactly what I've always been in your organization. A secondary person who happened to find something useful. She didn't say it with anger. She said it with a flat, unhurried delivery of someone reciting geography. I needed it to be undeniable. I needed you to understand, in a room with people who have no reason to flatter you, that this was not an accident. That I did this deliberately and entirely, and with every tool available to me. Why, Victor said. Why does that matter to you? She was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not a pause before a prepared answer, but the kind of silence that happens when a person is deciding whether to say the true thing. Because I'm about to have your child, she said. And I needed to know whether the man raising that child with me can look at evidence he didn't ask for and understand its value, or whether he only assigns value to things he personally directed. Victor didn't speak. That's the answer, she said. Why it matters. Malcolm had moved away tactful, or simply professionally disinterested in watching people have the conversations he clearly understood they were having. He was at the far end of the corridor with Rourke, speaking in low tones. Victor and Serena sat on the floor of the east corridor in the red-tinted emergency lighting and did not speak for perhaps 2 minutes. Then Victor said, Serena. She looked at him. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to tell me the truth. I've been telling you the truth all night, she said. I know. He looked at his hands, the risk management firm, the one you were working at when we met. She waited. Was that real, he said? Her expression changed, not much. Enough. Something that was almost not quite, but almost hurt at the edges. What kind of question is that, she said. I need to know, he said. I need to know whether the way you came into my life was what? Her voice had gone flat. The patience had not broken, but it had thinned. Engineered? Placed? Was I sent to you, Victor? Is that what you're asking? I'm asking because I don't know anything about you, he said. I thought I did. I thought you were... He stopped. I had you investigated before we married. 3 separate teams. I know, she said. He looked at her. I know you had me investigated, she said. I knew within a week of our first meeting. The investigative firm you used employs a man named Jarrett Walsh. Jarrett and I worked adjacent cases in Altman Province 4 years ago. He sent me a courtesy note. Her voice was completely level. I didn't run from it. I didn't do anything to obstruct it. I let your teams find what there was to find. Because what there was to find was the truth of what I actually am, a woman with a professional background, a set of skills, and a history that doesn't appear in the visible public record, because most of the meaningful parts of it were conducted under confidentiality agreements. Why didn't you tell me that? I told you I had done compliance work, she said. I told you I had worked in risk assessment for private clients. I told you both of those things at dinner, at the event where we met, in the first 40 minutes of conversation. You heard the words and filed them under professional background and moved on. She looked at him steadily. You heard what you needed to hear to be satisfied, Victor, is a pattern. It's not a failing specific to that dinner. It's how you process information about people you consider to be in a subordinate position to yourself. Victor looked at her for a long time. That's a hard thing to say to someone, he said. Yes, she said, but I've been waiting 14 months to say it, in a context where you couldn't walk away. He would have laughed, maybe, if the night had been different. Instead, he exhaled. The firm was real, she said. I was employed there on a contract basis. The work was real. My financial compliance background is completely genuine. What is also true is that certain clients I worked for during that period are people whose names I am legally prohibited from disclosing, whose operations overlap with areas that a man in your position would recognize immediately. Those clients were not in conflict with you. They were simply adjacent. Adjacent, Victor said. Yes, and Malcolm. Malcolm was a client, she said, through 2 degrees of separation and under a confidentiality structure. When his operation had the difficulty I described earlier, I was within reach, and I helped, and that created an obligation that Malcolm takes seriously. Victor stood up from the floor. He offered his hand. She looked at it. She took it. He pulled her up carefully, bearing most of the weight of the transition, because it was something he could do that didn't require any of the other things he was not yet equipped to offer. Steadied, released his hand. We need to find Marcus, Victor said. We need to find him before he finds out the breach failed, Malcolm said, from the far end of the corridor where he had apparently been listening to everything. Because the moment he knows his breach team didn't accomplish the objective, he shifts to contingency. What's his contingency? Victor said. Malcolm walked back toward them. His face had an expression that was not quite discomfort, but was the closest Malcolm Creed apparently came to it. I'd been hoping to address this after the immediate threat was contained, he said. Address it now, Victor said. The contingency, Malcolm said, is Serena. He looked at Victor with the expression of a man who has delivered difficult information before and has not become comfortable with it. She's the variable Marcus didn't fully account for. The file she built is beyond what he anticipated from this household. He knows someone inside this property has been working against him. He's known for approximately 3 weeks, based on the pattern of his accelerated extraction. He doesn't know how comprehensive the documentation is, but he knows there's a threat, and the threat originates from inside your home. He thinks it's me, Serena said. He knows it's you, Malcolm said. The corridor was very quiet. His contingency, Victor said slowly, is not to come after the organization. No, Malcolm said. It's to come after my wife. The child, Malcolm said, and his voice had gone carefully neutral, specifically. Marcus's communications, which Serena's file partially documents, indicate that he views the anticipated birth as the central scheduling factor, not merely as a period of organizational distraction, but as a personal leverage point. He intends to use the child as— Don't! Victor said. His voice was very quiet. The quiet was different from before. Before, the quiet had been control. This was something that had passed through control and come out the other side of it. Don't finish that sentence, he said. Malcolm didn't. Victor stood in the east corridor with his hand closed around. Nothing, the key was in his pocket. The phone was gone with Devlin. His hands were empty, and the information that had just been delivered to him was doing something to his internal architecture that he could feel physically, like a structural load shifting. He looked at Serena. She was looking at him with the expression he had been learning to read across the course of this night, the one that wasn't fear, wasn't fury, but was something at the intersection of both that she had made into a steady thing by sheer sustained will. He's been watching this house, Victor said. Not a question. For 3 weeks at minimum, Malcolm said, possibly longer. He knows about tonight. He knows something happened tonight. He doesn't have full information, but he knows his breach team failed to achieve its objective. By now, yes, which means, Victor said, the contingency is already in motion. Malcolm said nothing, because Malcolm was a man who had learned when silence was the accurate answer. Victor turned to look at the east wall of the corridor, the wall that the breach team had come through, the wall his house had absorbed and held. He stood looking at it for a long moment. Then he said to no one in particular, and to everyone present, he's not coming back here tonight. No, Malcolm agreed. He's already moved, Victor said. He's already positioned, yes. So we're not waiting for him to come to us. Victor turned. His voice had settled into something that the people who knew him well would have recognized, not the anger, not the control, but the thing underneath both of those, the original thing that had built the organization and the mansion and the 15 years of the life he had been living, the part that did not wait. Tell me where he is, Victor said. Malcolm reached into his jacket and produced a folded paper. Not a phone, not a digital file, paper. Old habit, the kind that certain kinds of people maintained regardless of technology, because paper didn't have a signal to jam. He held it out. Victor took it. He unfolded it. He read the address at the top of the page, and he read the name beneath it, and he read the third line, the line that indicated who else was confirmed to be at that location. and when he finished reading, he folded the paper back along its original creases with complete mechanical precision. Put it in his jacket pocket next to the key. He looked at Serena. "Stay here," he said. "Victor, I'm not asking because you can't handle yourself," he said. "I know what you can handle. I know it better than I did 4 hours ago. I'm asking because if I have to worry about where you are, I can't do what needs to be done. I need to know you're in one place and that it's a place I can account for." She looked at him. The calculation behind her eyes was visible. He had learned, in the last 4 hours, to see it. She was weighing variables. She was deciding whether his request was control or whether it was something that had been through the fire of everything tonight and come out as something else. "Malcolm stays here." "2 of my men stay," Malcolm said. "I go with Victor." Serena looked at Rourke, who had appeared at her right shoulder, with the quiet inevitability of a man who had already decided his position before the conversation started. "Rourke," she said. "I'm here," Rourke said. She nodded. She looked at Victor one more time. "The third name on that paper," she said. "The one below Marcus's. I saw Malcolm's face when he handed it to you." Victor didn't answer. "It's someone I know," she said. It wasn't a question. Victor said, "Don't look at the paper." "Victor, I'll tell you when I get back," he said. "I promise you I'll tell you everything when I get back." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You should know the secondary copy of the file. Complete version, not the excerpts Malcolm walked you through tonight. It's in the nursery," she said, "behind the third panel from the left wall. There's a cavity in the insulation. The drive is wrapped in a gray cloth." She held his gaze. "If something goes wrong, if you don't come back, that drive goes to Almeida directly, not through the organization, not through anyone who's had contact with Marcus. Almeida directly." Victor said, "Nothing is going to go wrong." Serena said, "I know. I'm telling you anyway." He looked at her. He wanted to say something that was adequate to the night they had just survived, and the night that was still in progress, and the 14 months that had preceded both. He wanted to say something that was not the kinds of things he usually said, the efficient declarative sentences that moved conversation toward resolution and away from the open ground where real things lived. Couldn't find it. So he said, "When I come back." "When you come back," she agreed. He turned and walked to the end of the corridor, and Malcolm fell into steps beside him, and they went through the door into whatever remained of the night. Behind them, Serena stood in the red-tinted light of the east corridor, with one hand on the wall and the other at her side, and her eyes on the door until it closed. Then she turned to Rourke. "The third name on that paper," she said. Rourke looked at her. "You've seen the file," she said. "All of it. You've known Malcolm's intelligence since before tonight." "Yes," said. "Then you know who it is." Rourke was quiet for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to tell her that he did, in fact, know. "Serena," he said carefully. "Tell me," she said. He told her, and the sound she made was not a cry and not a gasp, but something smaller and more private than either the sound some person makes when something they had suspected at the edges of their thinking for a long time finally arrives at the center and confirms itself, and the confirmation is both worse and more bearable than the uncertainty had been, because at least now the shape of it was known. She stood with it for 5 seconds. Then she straightened. "Get me to the nursery," she said. "I need the drive." The name Rourke gave her was Devlin. Serena stood with it for 5 seconds, as she had told herself she would, and then she moved. Not because she had processed it fully. Not because the shock had resolved into something manageable. But because the shock was a thing that could be carried while moving and could not be sat with in a corridor with a compromised property and a husband who had just walked out a door with the wrong information in his pocket. "He doesn't know," she said. "Victor?" Rourke kept pace beside her as she moved toward the west wing. "No." Malcolm withheld Devlin's name from the brief. He needed Victor operational. Not burning, Serena said. "Yes." "How long has Malcolm known?" 48 hours, Rourke said. "The financial trail in your file identified a routing structure we recognized from a previous operation. When we cross-referenced the authorization signatures, not the forged ones Marcus used, the real organizational signatures, Devlin's access codes, appeared in 3 separate transfer approvals over 14 months. Serena stopped walking. Rourke stopped with her. She stood in the west corridor, outside the library, and looked at the closed door of the room she had spent 14 months making into a place she could breathe in, and she thought very carefully about the geometry of what she'd just been told. "Devlin didn't just hold those people in the basement," she said. "No. He approved the financial movements. He was part of the structure. He was the internal mechanism," Rourke said. "Marcus architected. Devlin executed. The two external contacts provided federal cover for the transition. Devlin's role was to ensure that Victor's security apparatus didn't detect the operation, and to ensure that when the final move came, Victor's own protective infrastructure would fail at the critical moment. Serena thought about Victor walking out of the East Corridor, about Malcolm at his side, about the paper with the address and the two names Victor had seen, and the third name Malcolm had withheld, about Devlin, who was currently somewhere on the south side of the property, with Victor's secondary phone and an instruction to contact Almeida. Malcolm sent Devlin away, she said. Yes. With Victor's phone. With access to Almeida's contact. Yes. Does Malcolm know where Devlin is right now? Rourke's expression answered before he did. No, he said. Serena turned and walked directly back toward the East Corridor. Get me a line to Malcolm, she said. Any line. Whatever you have that isn't going through the mansion's jam network. I have a short-range radio that operates on a frequency below the jamming threshold, Rourke said, already reaching into his jacket. Range is limited. If Victor and Malcolm have moved off the property. Try, she said. Victor and Malcolm had not yet moved off the property. They were in the north vehicle bay, a secondary garage that sat behind the main structure and housed 3 vehicles that Victor maintained for operational use, none of which appeared on any registration connected to his primary identity. Malcolm had been to the property once before, briefly, 3 days ago, at Serena's direction, to familiarize himself with the exit routes. He knew where the bay was. Victor was checking the vehicle when the radio in Malcolm's jacket produced a burst of static, and then Rourke's voice, compressed and slightly degraded by the frequency, but functional. Malcolm held it up. Victor looked at it. Then Serena's voice came through, and Victor went very still. Devlin, she said. The single word carried everything necessary. Third name. It's Devlin. Victor did not move for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Malcolm. Malcolm's face did not perform surprise. It was the face of a man who had been waiting for this particular moment of disclosure and was watching to see how it landed. You knew? Victor said. I knew for 48 hours, Malcolm said. I needed you functional for the breach response. I made a tactical decision. Victor took the radio from Malcolm's hand. Serena. I'm here. Devlin has my secondary phone. He has Almeida's contact number. He's on the south side of the property. I know. He's also the man who authorized the transfer of those 3 people into the basement, who approved 14 months of financial extractions, who was supposed to ensure that my security failed at the critical moment. Victor's voice was flat and precise. He's been in my house for 7 years. A pause on the other end. Victor, Serena said. The witnesses he was supposed to extract if he's working with Marcus. Extracting them wasn't the objective. Getting them into a different location was. Victor looked at the vehicle in front of him. He looked at the garage door. He looked at the address on the folded paper in his jacket pocket. He's taking them to Marcus, Victor said. That's what I think, Serena said. Victor handed the radio back to Malcolm. To Malcolm, he said, your 48-hour tactical decision just put 3 civilian witnesses in a car with the man who's been trying to dismantle my organization. Malcolm accepted this without visible deflection. Yes. When this is over, Victor said, you and I are going to have a conversation about what constitutes information I need in real time. Understood, Malcolm said. Right now, Victor said, we're going to that address. And we're going faster than we planned. He pulled the garage door release. Get in. The address on the paper was 40 minutes from the mansion under normal conditions. Victor made it in 26. Malcolm rode in the passenger seat and did not comment on the driving. He spent the 26 minutes on a secondary radio of his own, coordinating with the 2 men he'd left on the property and attempting to raise contacts who could give him a position on Devlin's current location. What he got back was partial and not encouraging. Devlin's last confirmed position was the South Service Road, 11 minutes after leaving the mansion. After that, the trail went to a vehicle exchange point that Malcolm's contact identified as a location previously used by Marcus Vale's external operatives, a parking structure 3 miles from the property where a second vehicle had been waiting. He had a plan, Victor said. He said it without inflection. He had a very complete plan, Malcolm confirmed. He's been inside my house for 7 years building it. Not building it from the beginning, Malcolm said. Recruited, we think, approximately 2 years ago. Marcus would have taken time to identify the right person. Someone with genuine access and genuine trust. Someone who had already demonstrated they could manage Victor's security operations without raising questions. He never made a mistake I could see, Victor said. No, that's not loyalty, Victor said. That's performance. Malcolm said nothing. because there was nothing useful to add to that. Victor drove. The address resolved into a commercial district that had been mostly vacated, one of the post-industrial zones, that appeared in cities like this one, as the manufacturing base had contracted, leaving behind large buildings with functional infrastructure and very few people asking questions about what happened inside them. The specific building on the paper was a former logistics facility. 4 stories, ground floor accessible from 2 sides, upper floors accessible by interior stair only. Victor cut the headlights 2 blocks out. He parked in the shadow of an adjacent structure and sat for a moment looking at the target building through the windshield. Devlin knew we'd come here, he said. If he's been coordinating with Marcus, he knew this address would be on whatever intelligence Malcolm brought tonight. He knew I'd have it. Yes, Malcolm said. So either Marcus has already moved, or they want you here, Malcolm said. Yes. I've been sitting with that problem for the last 10 minutes. Victor looked at the building. The witnesses, he said. If Marcus needs to eliminate the witnesses, he needs to do it before I can place them with Almeida, before their documentation reaches anyone outside this structure. He doesn't have much time. He knows that. Which means he's here, Victor said. He's doing it now, or he's already done it. He opened the car door. Malcolm opened his. Victor, Malcolm said. If Devlin called ahead, if Marcus knows we're coming. Then Marcus knows I'm coming, Victor said. Good. The ground floor of the logistics building smelled like standing water and old machine oil, and the particular cold of spaces that haven't been heated in months. Victor moved through it with Malcolm 6 feet to his left, both of them using the residual ambient light from the street-facing windows, neither of them using a torch. Victor had been inside buildings like this before. Different cities, different decades, same geometry, the kind of large interior space that turns human movement into a problem of acoustics. Every footstep made a decision. He made them with the muscle memory of someone who had not needed to do this in 4 years, and discovered that the body retained its training with a fidelity that was almost insulting to the intervening time. The interior stairwell was at the northeast corner. They were halfway across the ground floor when Victor heard the voice, not speaking to him, speaking into a phone, or attempting to a voice that carried the distinctive pattern of one-sided communication, the rhythm of a man reporting a situation to someone not in the room. Victor stopped. Malcolm stopped. The voice was coming from behind a partial partition on the east side of the floor, former supervisor's station, probably, elevated 2 feet from the main floor level and glassed on 3 sides. One of the glass panels was missing. Victor recognized the voice after 4 words. Marcus Vale. He was on the phone. He was saying something about a timeline, about a vehicle, about a complication that had arisen in the property operation. His voice was the same voice it had always been measured. Deliberate. The voice of a man who processed everything through a particular filter before it came out. 11 years of quarterly reports. 11 years of that voice. Victor looked at Malcolm. Malcolm pointed left, indicating he would take the long route around the partition. His expression asked whether Victor intended to wait. Victor did not intend to wait. He walked directly to the partition. Marcus Vasel was standing with his back to the missing glass panel, phone to his ear, a laptop open on the former supervisor's desk. He was 60 years old or close to it. He had aged in the way of men who spend their lives indoors managing numbers. The hair had gone silver. The face had settled into precise lines. The posture remained functional, but not vigorous. He was wearing a dark coat and the kind of shoes that cost enough to be noticed. He heard Victor's footstep and turned. He did not run. He did not reach for anything. He lowered the phone from his ear and looked at Victor with an expression that Victor had never seen on his face in 11 years, and that he was now reading for the first time, not surprise. Something closer to conclusion. The expression of a man arriving at the end of a calculation. Victor, he said. Marcus, Victor said. The phone call was still connected. Victor could hear faintly a voice on the other end asking what was happening. Marcus ended the call. He set the phone on the desk beside the laptop. A deliberate gesture, not threatening, not surrendering. Organizing. Where are the witnesses? Victor said. Upper floor, Marcus said. 3rd landing. Devlin bring them? Devlin brought them, Marcus confirmed. Where's Devlin now? He left, Marcus said. When the breach operation at the property failed and it became clear the night wasn't going according to the original design, Devlin determined that his exposure was too significant to maintain. He has made arrangements for himself. He ran, Victor said. He exercised a contingency option, Marcus said, which I had provided for. You provided your inside man with an exit route in case the operation failed. I provide for all foreseeable contingencies, Marcus said. It's how I functioned for 40 years. Victor looked at him. The flatness in his own chest surprised him. He had expected rage of a specific quality, the kind that came with immediacy and heat. What he felt was different, colder, heavier, the kind of anger that has had time to settle into its full dimensions and has become, as a result, more structural than emotional. 11 years, Victor said. Yes, the Martin Avenue fire. 6 years ago, that was you. Marcus's expression did not change. The records in that vault would have complicated the ownership transition at the point of organizational restructuring. Removing them was a necessary preliminary step. The night my father died. You were away from the property, Marcus said. The timing presented itself. Victor took one step forward. Malcolm appeared in the gap where the glass panel had been. He positioned himself without moving further, not intervening, not retreating. Present. Marcus looked at Malcolm, registered him, returned his attention to Victor. You've been thorough tonight, he said. More thorough than I anticipated. I underestimated the scope of what your wife had compiled. Most people underestimate her, Victor said. I should have factored her background more carefully, Marcus said. He said it with the tone of a man identifying an error in a methodology, not a moral failing. When I identified her as the internal threat approximately 3 weeks ago, the documentation she had already assembled was more comprehensive than my models projected. I had assumed she was operating on intuition and partial information. She was not. She was operating on complete information, Victor said. She gathered herself. Without assistance, while pregnant, while living in the same house as the man trying to destroy the organization she was protecting. Marcus looked at him. You sound surprised? I'm not surprised, Victor said. I'm clarifying it out loud because I want you to understand that you failed not because of a system or a network or an intelligence operation. You failed because of one woman who was paying attention while you assumed she wasn't. Something moved across Marcus's face, the smallest possible version of something that was not quite respect and not quite disdain, but sat exactly between the two in a place that Marcus Vale had clearly spent considerable time. The child, Marcus said. Victor went still. The leverage model, Marcus said, was not what you've been told. Or perhaps it was, and you chose the interpretation that was most clarifying for your purposes. The child was not a target. The child was, he paused, selected a word, a symbolic factor. The birth represented a point at which Victor Reigns would have a reason to restructure, to rebuild, to potentially make decisions about the organization's future that would create an opening. It was a window, not a weapon. Don't, Victor said. His voice had gone to that particular register again. I'm clarifying. Don't tell me what you intended with my child, Victor said. Don't explain the model. Don't give me the methodology. He took another step. You sat across from me for 11 years. You were at my wedding. You stood in the hospital corridor and shook my hand when I told you about the pregnancy. You did all of that while building this. Marcus held his gaze. I did. And you feel... Victor stopped, because the question he was about to ask was one he realized he genuinely didn't know the answer to, and he understood suddenly that this was part of what had made Marcus so effective for so long, the absolute unreadability of whatever was happening behind those careful, deliberate eyes. You want to know if I feel something about it, Marcus said. Victor said nothing. I feel that I operated within the parameters of my own logic for a very long time, Marcus said, and that tonight those parameters were insufficient. I feel that about the operation. A pause. About you specifically, that's a different question. One I'm not certain to answer with the kind of honesty you're currently requiring. Try, Victor said. Marcus looked at him for a moment that stretched long enough to feel architectural. You built something real, Marcus said. In the early years, the first 5-6 years, you built something that had integrity in the way that certain structures have integrity. Not moral integrity. Structural, it held weight. It was in its way impressive. He paused. Then you built walls around yourself instead of building outward. You became a man who managed fear instead of building capability. You surrounded yourself with people who confirmed your existing map of the world rather than expanding it. You married a woman whose competence and complexity you systematically failed to engage with. And the organization, the real organization, the one with genuine structural integrity, began to hollow from the inside because its center was occupied by a man who had stopped being curious. The room was completely quiet. So you decided to take it, Victor said. I decided the structure deserved better management, Marcus said. I was not dispassionate about it. I want to be clear about that. I was not performing some neutral administrative function. I wanted it. I had wanted it for years. The operation was not purely strategic, it was also personal, and I am aware that that makes it something different than what I've just described. Victor looked at the laptop on the desk. The screen was open to a financial interface. He recognized an internal administrative portal that required three-factor authentication, and which only 2 people in the organization had complete access to. Marcus was one of them. "You're mid-transfer," Victor said. Marcus said nothing. "Right now," Victor said. "You're running a transfer through this machine right now." He walked to the desk and turned the laptop toward him. Screen showed a cascading authorization sequence, multiple accounts, multiple transfer targets, a structure he recognized from Serena's documentation and which Malcolm had walked him through at the mansion. The sequence was 80% complete. "How long has this been running?" Victor said. "Since approximately the time your breach team entered the logistics facility," Marcus said. "I anticipated that tonight's events would resolve toward this conversation. I wanted to ensure that regardless of outcome, the financial transition was completed." "Regardless of outcome," Victor said. "I have been thorough for 40 years, Marcus said. Tonight is not an exception." Victor looked at the screen. He looked at the progress bar. He looked at the authorization sequence, and he stopped. He looked at it more carefully. He leaned toward the screen and traced the account routing with his eyes, following the chain from origin to destination, through the shell structures and the subsidiaries and the offshore staging accounts. He stopped at the destination. He read the account name. He read it again. He straightened up and looked at Marcus with an expression that was not anger, was not shock. Was the particular look of a person who has just been handed a piece of information that retroactively reorganizes everything that preceded it into a new and worse shape. "This account," Victor said. "This destination account." Marcus waited. "This isn't your account," Victor said. "This isn't any account connected to you, or your external contacts, or the federal operatives, or anyone in the organizational structure you've been building for 18 months. Marcus said nothing. "Who does this account belong to?" Victor said. Malcolm was standing very still at the edge of his peripheral vision. "Marcus," Victor said, "who is the destination account holder?" Marcus looked at him with the expression of a man who has kept a specific secret for a very long time, and has at the moment of its revelation no expression adequate to the weight of it. "The account," Marcus said carefully, "belongs to a trust established 14 years ago in the name of an official owner who has maintained a very particular distance from every element of this operation. Someone who has had no visible involvement. Someone whose connection to tonight's events exists entirely in paperwork that is currently completing its transfer and will, in approximately 11 minutes, become the documentation of record for the new ownership of your organizational assets." "Give me a name," Victor said. Marcus picked up the phone from the desk. He pulled up a contact. He turned the screen toward Victor. Victor looked at the name. The name was Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss, who had introduced Serena Vale to Victor Rains at a private event 18 months ago. Harlan Voss, whose name Victor had barely remembered in the aftermath, whose face had been one of perhaps 60 at that event, whose presence he had not thought about once in the 14 months since. Harlan Voss, who had introduced Serena to Victor. The room tilted, not physically, but something in Victor's internal architecture, the same architecture that had taken the blow of Devlin's betrayal and the blow of Marcus's confession and held, structurally felt something give, not collapse, give like a wall absorbing a load it was rated for, and finding out the rating was wrong. "No," he said. The word came out before the thought was fully formed. Malcolm started. "No." Victor's voice was sharp. He looked at Marcus. "You're telling me the man who introduced my wife to me is the account holder. You're telling me Harlan Voss is the beneficial owner of whatever you've been building toward for 18 months. You're telling me?" He stopped, breathed. The breathing was harder than it should have been. "You're telling me Serena was placed?" "I'm telling you," Marcus said, quietly, and with something that was almost care, "that Harlan Voss introduced Serena Vale to you at that event, and that Harlan Voss is the destination account holder, and that these are facts. What connection exists between those facts, if any, is not something I can tell you, because it is the one element of this operation that I did not architect and do not have full visibility into." "What do you mean you don't have visibility into it?" Victor said. "Voss engaged me," Marcus said, "not the reverse. Approximately 2 years ago. He provided the initial operational concept, the preliminary financial modeling, and the external contacts. I provided the internal execution capability and the organizational knowledge. He provided the vision. I provided the mechanism. He paused. Voss is not a man who explains himself. He presented the structure, he identified the objective, and he funded the early operational costs. What I know about Serena's connection to Voss is only what I observed, which is that he introduced her to you, and that he was aware of her professional background in a level of detail that suggested prior acquaintance. Victor stood in the former supervisor's station of an abandoned logistics facility at 4 a.m. with this information. He stood with it the way a person stands, with something physically heavy not moving, not speaking, just bearing the weight, and assessing whether the structure is holding. Malcolm said carefully, Victor. Don't, Victor said. I need a minute, Victor said. Give me a minute. Malcolm was quiet. The progress bar on the laptop screen moved. 87%. Victor looked at it. If the transfer completed, the documentation of record would show a new beneficial owner for the organizational assets. Regardless of what Victor did afterward, regardless of what courts or lawyers or investigators might eventually determine, the paperwork would exist. Paperwork Marcus had spent 11 years demonstrating. This was the most durable thing in the world. He looked at the authorization sequence again. He looked at the routing structure. He traced it backward this time, from destination to origin, looking for the point in the chain where an intervention was still possible. There was one. A staging account, 2 links back from the destination, that was still holding the bulk of the transfer pending final authorization. The final authorization required a code that would be generated and transmitted automatically in 11 minutes, but the staging account itself could be frozen if someone with the right access credentials placed a hold order through the administrative portal. Victor looked at the portal interface. He looked at the authentication fields. Marcus. Your access credentials, Victor said. Marcus looked at the screen. He looked at Victor. Something moved behind his eyes, not fear, not calculation, but something that was surprisingly close to the thing that happened to people when they realized a situation had moved to a place they hadn't fully designed for. If I give you those credentials, Marcus said, the transfer fails. The documentation doesn't complete. Everything I've spent 2 years building ends, Victor said. Yes. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Give me a reason, he said. It was a strange thing to say. Victor heard it and understood it to be genuine, not a negotiation, not a delay tactic, an actual request. The witnesses upstairs, Victor said. 2 people who have been held in my basement for 6 weeks on forged documentation. If I walk out of here and those witnesses are returned to Almeida, they live. The documentation they hold becomes the basis for a legal case that exposes Voss and everything connected to him. If that transfer completes, Voss disappears into the ownership structure, and the witnesses become the only remaining evidence of what was built here. He paused. Voss has people. People who are not in this building and who have been waiting for this transfer to complete before executing the final element of the contingency plan. Marcus looked at him. The witnesses, Victor said. And my wife. The word landed. Marcus held Victor's gaze for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the laptop screen. He sat down in the supervisor's chair. He typed. The progress bar stopped at 91%. The staging account field showed a hold status. The automatic authorization sequence terminated. Victor let out a breath that he had not known he was holding. He took the laptop from the desk and handed it to Malcolm without looking at him. Can your people freeze this permanently? Yes, Malcolm said. Do it. Malcolm took the laptop. Victor looked at Marcus, who was sitting in the chair, looking at nothing in particular. The look of a man who has just made the decision that closes a door he spent 2 years building toward and is now in the first moments of whatever comes after. Upstairs, Victor said. You're taking me to the witnesses. Yes, Marcus said, and then you're going to tell me everything you know about Harlan Voss. Yes, Marcus said. And when we're done with that, Victor said, you're going to tell me exactly what you know about how Serena Vale came to be at that event 18 months ago. Every detail. Everything Voss said to you. Everything you observed. His voice was controlled and very quiet. Because I need to know whether the woman who spent 4 months protecting my life did it because she chose to, or because someone else chose for her. Marcus stood from the chair. He looked at Victor with the expression that had moved across his face earlier, not quite respect, and not quite disdain, but whatever lived between them. For what it's worth, Marcus said. It's worth very little right now, Victor said. Say it. The file she built, Marcus said. The scope of it. The method she used to compile it without detection. Without assistance, without a single resource from your organizational infrastructure. He paused. Nobody directed that. Nobody could have directed that. That was a woman making a choice, repeatedly, over 4 months, in a house where she had every reason not to. He paused again. Whatever Voss's original design was, and I genuinely don't know its full shape, what Serena Vale did in that house was hers. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Upstairs," and Marcus went. The third-floor landing was dark and cold, and smelled like the rest of the building water and time and concrete, doing what concrete does when no one is maintaining it. The two witnesses were in a room at the end of the landing. The same man and woman from the basement. They had been moved here recently enough that they were still wearing the same clothes, still carrying the particular exhaustion of people who have been uncertain about their immediate future for too long. They looked at Victor when he opened the door, and then they looked past him to Marcus Vale standing 3 feet behind, and their expressions did the complicated thing that expressions do when the person who facilitated your captivity and the person who is ostensibly ending it arrive in the same doorway. "Are you all right?" Victor said. The woman looked at him. "Same answer as before," she said, "alive. Not physically harmed." "I'm getting you out of here," Victor said. "Right now, Malcolm." Malcolm was already on his secondary radio, coordinating extraction. The man said Devlin. Victor looked at him. "The man who moved us here," the man said. "He said things on the drive. About a woman. About someone at the property." He paused. "He said something had gone wrong with the plan for her specifically. That there was someone else handling it." Victor's chest went cold. "What did he say exactly?" Victor said. "He said, and I'm giving you the exact words because I memorized them, because I thought they might matter," he said. "The Voss contingency for the woman doesn't need me. That's already in motion." Victor was already moving before the sentence finished. He was at the stairwell before Malcolm could follow, moving down 3 flights in the dark with a speed that had nothing managed or controlled in it, because the coldness in his chest had resolved into a single specific thought that was driving everything underneath it. Serena was at the mansion. The Voss contingency was already in motion, and he had left her there with 2 of Malcolm's men, and a drive she was retrieving from the nursery, and a name she had just learned, and no knowledge of what the name connected back to. He hit the ground floor at a run. Victor hit the ground floor running and didn't stop. The vehicle was where he'd left it, 2 blocks from the logistics facility, parked in the shadow of the adjacent structure. Covered the distance at a pace that his body had not been asked for in years, and that it delivered without negotiation, because the cold thing in his chest had removed all the intermediate calculations between intention and motion. He was in the driver's seat with the engine running. Before Malcolm cleared the facility door, Malcolm got in. He didn't say anything about the speed. He was on the radio before his door closed. "Rourke," he said. "Status." "Static." Then West Wing. "We have a situation." Victor pulled out before Rourke finished the sentence. "Define situation," Malcolm said. 2 men entered the property through the South Service access approximately 8 minutes ago. The route Devlin used to exit. Rourke's voice was compressed and tight. Came in clean, no forced entry, no alarm trigger. They had the access code. Devlin gave them the code, Victor said. He said it to the windshield. His hands on the wheel were steady in the way that hands go steady when there's no energy left for anything that isn't function. "Serena," Malcolm said into the radio. "A pause, she's mobile," Rourke said. "She was in the nursery when they entered. She heard them on the ground floor." Another pause, shorter, tighter. "She didn't wait for me." "What do you mean she didn't wait?" Malcolm said. "She went toward them," Rourke said. "Victor, she went toward them. I was 30 seconds behind her." Victor's jaw set. "Where is she now?" he said. "Main hall," Rourke said. She's talking to them." "Talking." Standing in the main hall, talking to 2 armed men, like she's conducting a meeting, Rourke said, and there was something in his voice that sat between professional disbelief and something that was, despite everything, a shade of reluctant recognition. "I have a position on the east side of the hall. Her instruction was to hold unless she signals." "Her instruction," Victor said. "She told me to hold." Victor pressed the accelerator. The thing about Serena Vale, that the 2 men in the main hall had not been briefed on that Harlan Voss had apparently not communicated to whoever had sent them, or had communicated, and they had assessed, as low priority was that she was not afraid of them, not performing composure, not suppressing fear into something manageable, not afraid. The two men had entered the main hall through the kitchen corridor and found a woman standing at the foot of the main staircase in a dark blue robe, with her hands at her sides and her posture completely level. Dante, and they had raised their weapons and said the things that men with weapons say in these situations, and Serena had looked at them and said, "You're going to want to think about the next 30 seconds very carefully." The taller of the two, the one who appeared to be senior, whose body language indicated he was accustomed to being the person in a room, who set the terms, had said, "Where's the drive?" "What drive?" Serena said. "Don't." His voice was flat. "We know you have documentation. We know it's on a physical drive. We know it's somewhere in this house. Give us the drive, and we leave." "And then what?" "Serena's ends." "It doesn't end," she said. "Whoever sent you, if the drive disappears, the people who compiled the documentation are still alive. The witnesses are still alive. The financial routing structures Marcus was running are frozen. The drive is one component. Destroying it doesn't close the file." The taller man looked at her. His partner had moved to cover the east side of the hall, which meant he was 8 feet from where Rourke was holding position behind the gallery partition, which Serena knew and which she was factoring. "The drive," the taller man said. "Last time, I'm going to tell you something," Serena said. Her voice was completely level. "And I need you to hear it as information, not as a threat, because I don't have anything to threaten you with, and I know that. The drive contains documentation that is useful only if it reaches the right people. If it's destroyed, copies exist. If those copies surface through irregular channels rather than the structured legal process my husband's lawyers are prepared to initiate, the result is worse for the people who sent you, not better. The irregular route is public. The legal route is manageable." The taller man's hand adjusted on his weapon. "You're stalling," he said. "I'm reasoning with you," she said. "There's a difference. You have about 10 seconds of reasoning left." Serena looked at him. She looked at the east side of the hall. She looked at the corridor behind the two men, through which she'd watched them enter. She looked back at the taller man. "Harlan Voss sent you," she said. Face moved, just slightly. "You know Voss," she said. "The drive," he said. But something had shifted in his voice, a frequency change too small for most people to detect. The sound of a man whose operating parameters have just been touched by an unexpected variable. "I know Voss," Serena said. "Not well, I've met him twice. Once when he introduced me to my husband, and once before that 3 years ago, when he presented himself to a risk management firm I was consulting for as a potential client." She kept her eyes on the taller man's face. "He didn't become a client. He was referred to us by someone I trusted, but when I sat across from him in the initial meeting, I declined to take him on. I documented my reasons for that refusal at the time. Those reasons are in my professional archive." She paused. "Which is not in this house." The taller man was very still. "So whatever Voss told you about me," Serena said, "whatever version of my relationship to him you were given as context, for tonight it's incomplete. And the specific way it's incomplete matters a great deal to whether what you do in the next 30 seconds makes your situation better or considerably worse." The shorter man said, from the east side of the hall, "Callum." The taller man, Callum, did not look at his partner. "How does it matter?" he said to Serena. "Because the archive that contains my documentation of that initial refusal meeting also contains the notes I took immediately afterward," Serena said. "Notes that describe in detail why I declined. Notes that reference specific elements of Voss's presentation that were inconsistent with his stated business purpose. Notes that would, if they surfaced in the context of a legal proceeding, provide a documented timeline of Voss's operational interests extending back 3 years before tonight." She let that sit for 1 second. "Notes that are currently in the hands of someone I contacted 2 days ago. Someone who is not connected to my husband, not connected to Malcolm Creed, and not connect to any structure that Harlan Voss has access to." Callum looked at her. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you documented Voss 3 years ago." "I'm telling you that a legal proceeding involving tonight's events becomes significantly more damaging to Voss if my archive surfaces than if only the drive surfaces," Serena said. "And I'm telling you that whether my archive surfaces through a controlled legal channel or through an uncontrolled one depends entirely on what happens in this hall in the next 30 seconds. Callum lowered his weapon. "Not all the way. Part way. The kind of lowering that says I'm thinking, not I'm done." "Callum," his partner said again. "Tighter this time." "Shut up," Callum said. "To Serena if I walk out of here." "You walk out of here and I make one phone call," Serena said. "The archive goes to a specific attorney through a specific channel. Not public. Contained. Voss's exposure is real, but it's manageable through legal process. She held his gaze. If you don't walk out of here, the archive goes to 4 journalists simultaneously within the hour. That is also already arranged. Callum stood in the main hall of Victor Raines's mansion at 4:15 in the morning and looked at a 7 months pregnant woman in a dark blue robe and made the calculation that his life had brought him to. 4 journalists, he said. 4, Serena said. He looked at his partner. Partner looked back, with the expression of a man who has been in enough rooms to know when the architecture of a situation has shifted beyond the point where aggression is the profitable option. Callum put his weapon down to his side. We were never here, he said. No, Serena said. You weren't. They left through the kitchen corridor. Serena stood at the foot of the main staircase and listened to the sound of their footsteps moving away through the house, and then the sound of the south service door closing, and then silence. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them. The shaking was fine and fast, the kind that comes from sustained adrenaline meeting the moment it's no longer required. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. Rourke came through the gallery partition. He looked at her. He looked at the empty hall. He looked at her hands. 4 journalists, he said. I know 2 journalists, Serena said. The rest was math. Rourke stared at her for a moment. Then he said, we need to get you sitting down. In a minute, she said. Did you raise Malcolm? Trying. Victor's coming back, she said. He knows about the contingency. He's going to come through that door, moving fast, and I need to be... She stopped. Breathed again. I need to not look like I almost just had a serious problem, Serena said. You're shaking. I know I'm shaking, she said. I'll stop in a minute. Get me Malcolm. Victor came through the front door at 4:22. He came through it the way she'd told Rourke he would fast, with Malcolm 2 steps behind him, his eyes moving across the hall in the systematic sweep of someone who has been running threat assessment in their head for the last 26 minutes at high speed. He saw Serena standing at the foot of the staircase. She watched something happen to his face that she had not seen happen to it before. It wasn't relief in the simple version, it was more structural than that. The visible decompression of a man who has been running on a specific terrible fear and has had it removed suddenly enough that the body doesn't immediately know what to do with the absence. He crossed the hall in 8 steps. He stopped in front of her, close. He looked at her face, then at her hands, then at her face again. You're shaking, he said. I know, she said. It's stopping. What happened? 2 men, she said, Voss's people. They came through the south access with Devlin's code. She kept her voice level because the shaking was in her hands, and she was not going to let it move anywhere else. They wanted the drive. I talked to them. Victor looked at her. You talked to them, he said. They left, she said. The drive is still in the nursery. Behind her, she heard Malcolm make a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite anything else, a sound of compressed professional acknowledgement that had nowhere appropriate to go. Victor said, Serena, I'm all right, she said. You're shaking. I said it's stopping. She met his eyes. I'm all right. The baby's all right. The drive is in the nursery. The witnesses, did you get the witnesses? Malcolm's people are extracting them now, he said. They're going to Almeida. And Marcus? Victor's expression did something complicated. Cured, he cooperated at the end. He froze the transfer. A pause. There's more. We need to talk about Voss. I know about Voss, she said. He looked at her carefully. How much do you know? I know he introduced us, she said. I know the destination account. I know that Malcolm's read as that Voss engaged Marcus, not the reverse. She held his gaze. I know what you're about to ask me then. Tell me, he said. Tell me straight. The hall was very quiet. Serena looked at her husband, at the man who had grabbed her wrist on the staircase 6 hours ago, and the man who had stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at her, and the man who had sat on the floor of the east corridor, and said, I should have asked, and she understood that the question he was asking her now was the most important one. Either of them had spoken across 14 months of marriage. I met Voss 3 years ago, she said. Before I met you. He presented himself as a potential client. I declined to take him on because there were inconsistencies in his stated business purpose that I documented at the time. I didn't like him. I didn't trust him. She paused. When he introduced us at the event 18 months ago, I didn't connect him immediately to the client refusal. He uses different corporate identities for different contexts, and the introduction was casual enough that I didn't register his name as the same person until later. How much later? Victor said. 3 weeks after we were married, she said. I was going through old professional files, and I saw the archived notes from the refusal meeting. The name was the same. I did due diligence, confirmed they were the same person. And then I sat with it. You sat with it, Victor said. I sat with it for 2 weeks, she said, trying to determine whether the coincidence was a coincidence, whether Voss had engineered the introduction specifically, or whether he simply moved in circles where our paths crossing was statistically probable. What did you decide? I decided I couldn't determine it from the available information, she said. And I decided that the way I had come to be at that event, through a professional contact, through a chain of circumstances I could trace and verify, was genuine. My reasons for being there were genuine. What I felt when I met you was, she stopped. It was real, Victor. Whatever Voss intended or didn't intend, I was at that event as myself. I stayed because I chose to. I married you because I chose to. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Why didn't you tell me, he said, when you made the connection? 3 weeks in. Why didn't you tell me you'd met him before? Because I didn't know what it meant yet, she said. And because we were 3 weeks into a marriage that was still finding its shape, and I walked in every day trying to understand what kind of man you actually were, behind the version you showed the world, and I didn't have enough information yet to know whether bringing you something uncertain would make you careful or would make you... She stopped. Would make me what, he said. Dangerous in the wrong direction, she said quietly. I needed to know you better before I handed you an incomplete picture of a possible threat. Because incomplete pictures, in your hands, at that stage, I didn't know what you'd do with it. He absorbed this. You were assessing me, he said. I was learning you, she said. That's different. Is it? Yes, she said. Assessing is looking for a verdict. Learning is trying to understand. I was trying to understand you. I was still trying when I found the first discrepancy 4 months ago and understood that the thing I'd been uncertain about for over a year had finally given me enough information to act on. Victor stepped back. 1 step. Not away from her sideways, moving to the base of the staircase railing, putting one hand on it the way a person puts a hand on something solid when they need a moment with their own weight. Voss put you in my life, he said. I was in my life, she said. Voss put himself in the chain that led to one evening. What I did with the evening was mine. He built this whole operation around you being here, Victor said. The internal access, the timeline. The way Marcus built the breach plan, around someone with specific property knowledge. Victor, she said, look at me. He looked at her. File I built, she said. The 4 months. The drive in the nursery. Malcolm standing behind me when you came downstairs. Her voice was steady now. The shaking in her hands fully stopped. None of that was Voss's plan. None of that was Marcus's design. None of that was anything except me, in this house, choosing what to do with what I knew. She held his gaze. You can spend the next 6 months deciding how much of my presence in your life was engineered. Or you can look at what I actually did with the time I was here. Victor looked at her. The hall was quiet. From somewhere in the property, a door opened and closed Malcolm, or one of his people, moving through the house with the particular purposeful quiet of operational work being wrapped up. The sounds of a night winding down toward something that was not quite resolution, but was oriented in that direction. Victor said, Voss. Yes, she said. He's not in this building. He's not on this property. He's somewhere with lawyers and a buffer of distance and probably a version of events already prepared for whatever comes next. Yes, she said. The transfer Marcus froze, it's still frozen. But Voss has resources that don't depend on that transfer completing. He doesn't need the organizational assets. He needs the legal exposure to stay manageable. Victor's voice was thinking aloud, working through the structure, which means the move against Voss isn't financial. Documentary, it's the witnesses. It's Serena's archive. It's Marcus cooperating in exchange for he stopped. What did you offer Marcus? She said. I didn't offer Marcus anything. That was your conversation. But you anticipated it, he said. When you built the file, when you planned tonight, you anticipated that if Marcus was cornered, his cooperation had value, and that his cooperation required an incentive. She was quiet for a beat. I anticipated that Marcus is a man who spent 11 years building something he cared about, she said, and that a man who builds something cares about what happens to it when he's gone. If he cooperates fully, documentably, on the record, the organizational structure he built, the parts of it that were legitimate, can be restructured rather than demolished, which matters to him more than he would admit. Victor looked at her. You built the exit ramp for him, Victor said. I built a possible exit ramp, she said. You're the one who decides whether anyone drives down it. Victor pushed off the railing. He crossed the hall to where Serena was standing, and he stopped in front of her, closer than before, and he looked at her with an expression that had shed everything performative and everything managed and was, at its bare surface, the look of a man who is seeing a specific thing clearly for the first time. "I owe you," he started. "Don't," she said. "Serena." "Not now," she said. "Not at 4 a.m. with blood on your jacket, and my hands still coming down from shaking. Not like this." She looked at him steadily. "There's a conversation we need to have. About all of it, Voss. What I knew, what I didn't tell you, what you didn't ask. We need to have that conversation properly. When it's daylight and we've both slept and we can sit across from each other without a crisis as the context. And if I need to say something now?" he said. She looked at him. "Then say it small," she said. "Say the smallest true version of it and save the rest." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you're here. Not I'm glad you're safe. Not I'm glad you weren't hurt." The specific words he chose, which were not the easy words and not the expected words, but were the exact words that addressed the actual question, the one neither of them had spoken directly all night, which was whether she should have been here at all. Serena looked at him. "Okay," she said. Malcolm came through the kitchen corridor. His jacket was gone. His sleeves were rolled. He had the look of a man who has been working without audience for the last 20 minutes and is returning with information. "The witnesses are in transit," he said. Almeida confirmed receipt. "Marcus is being held in the East Room under Rourke's supervision, pending whatever you decide to do with him formally." He looked at Victor. "My recommendation is that the next action is Voss. Tonight, before he wakes up to the news that the transfer failed and his extraction team left without the drive." "How do we get to Voss?" Victor said. "Marcus gave me 3 contact structures," Malcolm said. "Legal addresses, not operational ones, which means they're real and they're current. Voss is a man who uses legal infrastructure as his armor, which means the approach that strips that armor is a legal one." He looked at Serena, her archive. The documented refusal meeting from 3 years ago, combined with the financial routing Marcus exposed, and the witness testimony that's a case that doesn't require a single illegal action to prosecute. "You're saying we take this to the legal system," Victor said. "I'm saying," Malcolm said carefully, "that the particular situation of Harlan Voss, a man who has insulated himself from operational exposure through layers of legitimate corporate structure, is most effectively addressed through the same system he used as insulation." "Yes." Victor looked at him. "That's not how I've operated for 15 years, Victor said. "No," Malcolm said. "It isn't." The 3 of them stood in the main hall, Victor, and Malcolm, and Serena in the near quiet of a house that had survived a night designed to end it. And the question Malcolm had just posed hung in the air, with the particular weight of questions that aren't really about the surface topic. Victor looked at Serena. She was looking at him with the expression he had learned across the course of this night. The one that wasn't instruction and wasn't waiting, but was something that offered him the space to arrive at his own conclusion, while being entirely clear about which direction she was facing. He looked at the hall, his hall. The iron gate, the marble floor, the staircase where 6 men had formed a line behind his pregnant wife, and changed the shape of everything he thought he knew. He said, "I want Marcus to understand the terms." "I'll get him," Rourke said from the gallery. "And I want to call Almeida myself," Victor said, directly. "Tonight." "Phone," Malcolm said, producing one. Victor took it. He looked at Serena one more time. "Go sit down," he said. Not a command. An ask with the specific texture of something that had learned the difference. She considered him. 10 minutes, she said. "Take 20, he said. She went to the library, her room, the room she'd made habitable across 14 months, and she sat in the chair by the window, and she placed one hand on her stomach, and she looked at the dark outside the glass and breathed. In the hall, Victor called Almeida. In the east room, Rourke brought Marcus out, and across the city, in a building whose address was on a piece of paper in Victor's pocket, Harlan Voss's phone began to ring with news he had not prepared for: the transfer frozen, the extraction team withdrawn, the witness testimony secured, and a legal case being assembled in real time by people who had spent the night doing the precise opposite of what he had spent 18 months engineering them to do. Voss stood at his window and listened to his phone ring with the news, and he made the calculation that his own life had brought him to. And somewhere in the calculation, there was a variable he had placed himself the introduction, 18 months ago, of a woman he had assessed as manageable. He was still calculating when his front door came open. Not his people. Victor's. The door came open and 2 men entered, who were not Malcolm's men and not Marcus's men, but were men from a part of Victor Raines's organization, that Malcolm had not been briefed on, a part that predated Marcus, predated the offshore restructuring, predated the years of managed control, and that Victor had called in the car on Malcolm's secondary phone when Serena's voice had come through the radio, and he had understood, with physical certainty, what the night was going to require of him by the time it ended. Voss looked at the two men. He looked at the door. He understood the calculation had concluded. "Sit down," the first man said. Voss sat, and in the main hall of the mansion, Victor put down Almeida's call and looked at Malcolm with the expression of a man who has just made a decision that is going to take a long time to fully account for in both directions, the direction of what it cost and the direction of what it was worth. "Done," he said. Malcolm looked at him steadily. "Not yet, no," Victor said. "Not yet." He looked toward the library, toward the closed door behind which Serena was sitting with her hand on her stomach and the dark outside the glass. "But it's going to be." Malcolm said nothing, because Malcolm Creed was a man who understood the difference between a situation that had been resolved and a man who had decided to become the kind of person capable of resolving it. And he understood that the second thing, which was happening right now in the main hall of this mansion, was the harder of the two and the one that actually mattered. Victor walked to the library door. He stood outside it for a moment. Then he knocked. 3 seconds passed. "Come in," Serena said. He opened the door. She was in the chair by the window, one hand on her stomach, her dark hair loose, the library around her, holding the quiet of a room that had been lived in and chosen and made into something that mattered over the course of 14 months by someone who had understood what she was doing even, when the person she was doing it alongside did not. Victor stepped inside. He closed the door behind him. He stood looking at his wife in the library. She had built in his house and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Serena said, "Is it over?" Victor looked at her. "Voss is secured," he said. "The witnesses are with Almeida. Marcus has agreed to cooperate. The transfer is frozen." He paused. "The legal process is going to take time. There are going to be things that surface. About the organization. About decisions I made that are going to be difficult to." He stopped. "Going to be complicated." "I know," she said. "I'm going to need to dismantle things," he said. "Significant things. Structure I built, the way I've operated." His voice was careful and precise, in the way of a man choosing words that have real weight. "I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I know the direction." Serena looked at him. "Why?" she said, not a challenge, a genuine question. Victor looked at the window, at the dark outside it, at the glass that separated the room from the night. "Because I've been running something for 15 years that I told myself was about survival," he said. "And tonight I watched my pregnant wife stand in the main hall of this house and talk 2 armed men into leaving with nothing. Using nothing except information she had personally compiled and judgment she had built over years I didn't ask her about." He paused. "And I understood that the thing I've been calling survival is not the same thing as what she was doing. She was surviving, I was just maintaining. Serena was quiet." "There's a difference," he said. "Yes," she said. "I've been maintaining control of something that was hollowing," he said. Marcus was right about that part, even if everything else he did with the information was wrong. The organization was hollow because I stopped building it and started protecting it. And the thing I was most protecting it from, he stopped, was change, Serena said. Was people, he said. Real people. People who might see something differently than I did and be right about it. He looked at her. I stopped letting people be right about things I was wrong about. And then I married someone who was right about almost everything and spent 14 months not asking her any questions. The library was very quiet. Outside the window, the dark had the particular quality of the hour before dawn, not lighter yet, but different in its texture, the way darkness changes when the night has decided it's nearly done. Serena said, "The conversation we said we'd have when it's daylight." "Yes," he said. "It's almost daylight," she said. Victor looked at the window. She was right. The sky at its far edge had begun the slow process that preceded dawn, not light exactly, but the retreat of the deepest dark. "Almost," he said. She shifted in the chair, and he crossed the room without being asked and offered his hand, and she took it, and he helped her up with the careful attention of someone who has learned, over the course of a single night, the specific weight and value of what he is holding. She stood. They were very close. She looked up at him with the expression he had been learning all night, the one that was not fear and not performance, but was the thing underneath both. The original thing, The actual person who had been standing in this house for 14 months, waiting to be accurately seen. "I have one question," Victor said, before the daylight conversation. "Ask it," she said. "The night we met," he said. "The dinner. When you asked me what I was actually afraid of." He looked at her steadily. "Did Voss tell you to ask that?" Serena looked at him for a long moment. And then, for the first time since the night had started, she smiled small and real and slightly tired at the edges, the smile of a woman who has been waiting for the right question for 18 months and has finally received it. "No," she said. "You asked it yourself," he said. "I asked it myself," she said. "I wanted to know. What did you decide?" he said, after I didn't answer. "I decided you were afraid of exactly what you turned out to be afraid of," she said. "Losing something you couldn't replace. The problem was you'd misidentified what was irreplaceable." She held his gaze. "You thought it was the organization." "Yes," he said. "It wasn't," she said. Victor looked at his wife. Outside, the dark was retreating, and in the east room, Marcus Vall sat with Rourke and prepared to give the testimony that would end one structure and allow another to begin. And in the city, Harlan Voss sat with Victor's people and understood for the first time in 18 months that he had miscalculated the variable he was most certain of. And in a vehicle moving through the pre-dawn streets, two witnesses who had spent 6 weeks uncertain about their futures felt, for the first time, something that moved tentatively in the direction of relief. And Victor Rain stood in his wife's library, with the daylight coming, and his hand still holding hers, and the understanding new and not yet comfortable, but real, that the thing he had built his life around protecting had never been the right thing, and that the right thing was standing in front of him, and had been standing in front of him for 14 months. The daylight conversation took 3 hours. Not because either of them had prepared a speech. Not because there was a structure to it, an agenda, a sequence of disclosures organized by severity. It happened the way real conversations happen, between people who have spent too long not having them, unevenly, with long silences that weren't empty, with sentences that started in one direction, and arrived somewhere the speaker hadn't anticipated. They sat in the library. Serena had moved from the chair to the small sofa near the east wall. Victor sat across from her in the chair she'd vacated, his jacket gone, his sleeves rolled to the forearm, the silver keys on the table between them, because he'd taken it from his pocket without thinking, and placed it there, and neither of them had moved it. Victor went first. Not because he was ready, because he understood, after everything the night had taught him, that the person who had earned the right to go first was Serena, and that giving her that right meant going first himself. He told her about the organization. Not the version he gave to lawyers or to the men who worked for him, the actual version. The decisions he had made in the first 5 years that had built the structure Marcus had later identified as worth taking. The decisions in the years after that had been less about building and more about insulating. Point he could identify it now, looking backward, where he had stopped being a man who understood risk and had become a man who was afraid of it, and had used the appearance of control to manage that fear without admitting it existed. He told her about his father. About the night his father had died, and the vault had burned simultaneously, which he had not connected until Marcus named it in the logistics facility, and which he was now sitting with the full weight of the understanding that he had been at the hospital, grieving, while the man he had trusted most for 11 years used the hours of that grief to remove the architectural foundation of the organization. He told her what that felt like. He used the word felt without flinching, which cost him something, and he did it anyway. Serena listened. She did not perform listening, she simply was present, in the specific way he was learning to recognize as her default mode, the way she occupied a room with her full attention directed outward rather than inward. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew about the vault." He looked at her. "Not that Marcus set the fire," she said. "I didn't know that until last night. But 4 months ago, when I found the first discrepancy and began building the file, one of the threads in the financial routing pointed to a set of accounts that referenced the Martin Avenue structure. The naming convention was consistent with organizational archive protocol from before the fire." She paused. "I found the discrepancy and knew the vault records hadn't been destroyed. I knew they'd been removed. I didn't know by whom or why." "That's in the file?" he said. "The thread is in the file," she said. "I didn't follow it to its conclusion, because following it would have required accessing archive structures I didn't have authorization for, and accessing them without authorization would have been detectable." She held his gaze. "I left the thread visible in the documentation, but undeveloped. I assumed whoever reviewed the file with full organizational access would follow it themselves. Malcolm followed it, Victor said. Malcolm followed it, she confirmed. Victor looked at the key on the table between them. You documented the thread, knowing you couldn't pursue it yourself, he said. I documented everything I could reach, she said, and noted the edges of what I couldn't. He looked at her for a moment. That's how you work. Yes, she said. You build to the boundary of your access, and you mark the boundary clearly. Yes, so that whoever has access you don't have can pick it up without wasting time re-establishing what's already known. That's the methodology, she said. It's not elegant, but it works. Victor nodded slowly, not in agreement with a position in the way that people nod when something has clicked into place that should have clicked a long time ago. Then Serena talked. She told him about the 3 years before they met. Not the complete version, there were elements under confidentiality that she named as present without detailing, and he accepted this without pushing because accepting it was another thing the night had taught him. She told him about the work she had done, the clients she had taken, and the one she had refused. She told him about the refusal meeting with Voss described him across the table, the way he had presented the business structure, the specific inconsistencies she had documented in her notes afterward. She told Victor what those inconsistencies were in enough detail that Victor could identify what they indicated. He was building a legal structure around an operational center that didn't legally exist, Victor said. Yes, she said. The corporate entities were real. The stated business purpose was coherent. But the way the funding flowed, the direction of it, the staging intervals, was consistent with someone using legitimate corporate infrastructure to move money on behalf of interests that couldn't appear on any document. And you saw that in one meeting. I saw the shape of it, she said. I didn't know what specific interests. I didn't pursue it beyond the refusal. I documented my reasoning, filed it, and moved on. And then 18 months later, he put you in the same room as me. Yes. Victor was quiet for a moment. Do you know why? His actual reason? Serena looked at the key on the table. I've thought about it since Rourke told me his name, she said. Voss needed the operation to have an internal component, someone inside the organization, who could observe and who had specific skills. Marcus was the financial mechanism. Devlin was the security mechanism. But Marcus and Devlin were both identifiable as organizational personnel. They existed in the structure. They appeared in records. They had histories that connected to Victor Raines. She paused. A spouse is different. A spouse has access that doesn't appear in any organizational record. A spouse can move through a household without surveillance because surveillance of a household requires surveilling the person you live with. And most men in Victor's position, she stopped. Don't surveil their wives, Victor said, because they don't consider their wives a variable worth monitoring. Yes, she said. He placed you expecting you to be a passive conduit, Victor said. Someone with access who would unknowingly provide information through the normal behavior of a spouse in an organizational household. Conversations overheard. Documents seen. Patterns observed. I think so, she said. I think he expected a woman in my position to function as an unwitting intelligence source. He knew my professional background gave me observational capability. He expected that capability to work for him without my knowing it. Instead, it worked against him. Instead, I saw the discrepancy, she said, and I made a different choice than he'd planned for. Victor looked at her. He miscalculated you, he said. He assessed me based on what I was positioned as, she said, not what I actually was. The library held the early morning light now, real light, daylight, the kind that comes in flat and honest, and makes everything in a room look like what it actually is. The key on the table between them caught it and held it in the worn silver surface. Victor said, Voss is in custody. I know. He's going to have lawyers working within the hour. He's going to construct a legal defense that tries to create distance between himself and everything that happened last night. Victor's voice was measured and not angry. It's going to be a long process. Yes, she said. The organization is going to be examined in that process, he said. Everything, my finances, my operational history, decisions I made over 15 years. Some of what surfaces is going to be, it's not all going to look like what I'd want it to look like. I know that, she said. It may be difficult for you, he said. Specifically, your name is connected to mine. The foundation, the public-facing structures we've built, they'll be scrutinized. Victor, she said. He looked at her. I built a file on my husband's corrupt advisors while 7 months pregnant in a house with no allies, she said. I can manage scrutiny. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, I imagine you can. The silence that followed was a different kind from all the silences across the night. It wasn't tense, it wasn't held. It was the silence of two people sitting in a room together who have said the things that's saying and are now in the first moments of whatever comes after, uncertain in its specifics, oriented in its direction. Victor reached across and picked up the key. He turned it over in his palm the way he had been turning it over all night, feeling the worn edges, the stamped numbers on the reverse. He looked at Serena. "I'd like to know," he said, "what you were actually afraid of. That night at the kitchen table. When you were sitting there with the cold tea." She looked at him. The question surprised her, not the topic, but the precision of it. That he had remembered the kitchen table. That he had gone back to it, across everything the night had contained, and identified it as the thing he needed to ask about. "I was afraid," she said slowly, "that I had made an accurate assessment of you too late to be useful." "What assessment?" "That you were a man who was capable of being someone worth staying for," she said. "But that the situation was already too far along, that what Marcus had been building was too complete, and what existed between us was too thin, and that the combination meant nothing I could do would be enough to change the outcome." "You were afraid it was too late," he said. "I was afraid the window had closed," she said. "Between the point where change was possible and the point where it wasn't." "And now?" he said. She looked at him with the expression he had been learning all night, except it was different now in the daylight. Clearer, less guarded at the edges. The expression of a woman who has decided, after a long period of careful assessment, that the person across from her has passed a test she never announced she was administering. "Now I think the window is open," she said. "I think it opened last night somewhere between the east corridor floor and the library door." She paused. "I think you knocked." Victor looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the key down on the table. He stood up, crossed to the sofa where she was sitting, and he sat down beside her, not performance, not a gesture loaded with obligation. Just sitting beside his wife in the room she had chosen for herself in his house. In the morning light, after the longest night either of them had survived. She didn't move away. After a moment, she leaned slightly, the smallest adjustment of weight, the most minimal possible version of leaning, as though she was uncertain whether it was welcome, and was willing to test the question with the absolute minimum investment. He didn't move away either. They sat like that in the library, while the light came in flat and honest and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. The legal process lasted 14 months, not because the case was weak. The case, assembled from Serena's file, the witness testimony, Marcus's full cooperation, and the professional archive Serena had maintained for 3 years, was more comprehensive than any of Voss's attorneys had prepared for. It lasted 14 months because Harlan Voss was a man who had spent 4 decades building legal infrastructure for exactly this purpose, and dismantling it required patience and precision in equal measure. Marcus Vale testified for 11 days. He was methodical on the stand in the way he had been methodical across 40 years of professional life, organized, precise without visible emotion. He named names. He produced documentation. He described the operational structure in the specific detail of a man who had been its primary architect and had decided, for reasons he did not publicly articulate, to let the architecture be fully seen. The reasons, which he stated only once in a preliminary hearing that was not covered by the press, were these: the organization he had built alongside Victor Rains in the early years had been worth building. The thing he had been trying to take had ceased to resemble the thing he had wanted. And the person who had ultimately stopped the operation was a woman who had operated with more structural integrity than anyone else involved, on any side, and he found he did not want to be the man who had undermined her. The judge at the preliminary hearing had looked at him for a long moment after this statement and then moved on without comment. Devlin was found 6 weeks after the night of the breach, in a city 3 countries away, through the same network Malcolm Creed maintained for exactly this kind of retrieval. He was returned to face legal proceedings. He did not cooperate in the way Marcus had cooperated. The testimony was partial, calculated, the testimony of a man still managing his exposure rather than resolving it. It was sufficient, combined with the existing documentation, to close the evidentiary gaps that his absence had created. Harlan Voss's legal defense was exactly what Victor had anticipated: distance, misdirection, the construction of a narrative in which he was a businessman, with no direct operational knowledge of the events of that night, whose name appeared on certain documents only through the normal structure of investment interests he maintained at arm's length. It held for 4 months. It collapsed in the 5th month, when Serena's professional archive was formally entered into evidence, specifically the notes from the initial refusal meeting 3 years prior, which documented, in Serena's precise and contemporaneous language, specific inconsistencies she had observed in Voss's stated business purpose, the names of 2 entities he had referenced that later appeared in Marcus's operational documentation, and a single sentence at the end of the notes that read, "Decline." This structure is what I believe it to be. The liability of association is not manageable, and the ethical exposure is clear. The sentence had been written 3 years before the night of the breach, before the marriage, before any of it. Voss's attorney had argued that the notes were retrospectively colored by subsequent events. The date stamp on the archived file had been independently verified by 3 forensic analysts. The case concluded in the 14th month. Voss received a sentence that his attorneys immediately appealed. The appeal was ongoing. Victor's lawyers, working in concert with Almeida's network and 2 prosecutors who had been waiting for exactly this documentation for longer than anyone in the courtroom knew, advised that the appeal had a narrow trajectory. Victor attended the sentencing. He sat in the gallery. Not at the table, he was not a party to the criminal case, having cooperated fully with the investigation in exchange for a restructuring agreement that addressed his own organizational history. He sat in the gallery and watched Harlan Voss stand before the bench, and he did not feel what he had expected to feel, which was the particular satisfaction of a specific score settled. He felt instead tired. Tired in the honest way, the way that comes after something has actually ended rather than the fatigue of ongoing vigilance. He recognized the difference because he had spent 15 years in the second kind and had forgotten the first kind existed. He left before the room cleared. The mansion was not a fortress anymore. This was not a metaphor. The physical changes were real and documented. The iron gate remained, but the perimeter security had been restructured. The rotating armed detail had been reduced to 2 permanent staff whose function was more accurately described as property management than tactical defense. The surveillance system still operated, but its footage was no longer routed to a private server that only Victor could access. Serena had suggested this. Victor had agreed without needing to be persuaded twice, which was itself a change from the man he had been. The East Wing remained his office. The West Wing remained her domain, the library, the nursery, the sitting room. The boundary between the territories had dissolved in practice, the way boundaries dissolve when the people maintaining them stop needing them. He went to the library in the evenings. She came to the East Wing in the mornings, sometimes, and drank her coffee at the window while he worked, and they did not always talk and did not always need to. The nursery had been painted twice. The first color had been wrong. Serena had chosen it quickly, under the pressure of the final weeks before the birth, and had stood in the doorway a week after applying it and said, "That's not right," and had repainted it herself over a weekend, which Victor had observed from the doorway and had offered to help with, and had been permitted to assist with the second coat only, because Serena's standards for even coverage were more exacting than his. The second color was right. Their daughter was born on a Tuesday morning in March, at a hospital 20 minutes from the mansion, with a delivery that was medically unremarkable in the way that deliveries involving high-risk situations sometimes are all the preparation for difficulty, and then the difficulty declines to arrive, and the thing happens with a simplicity that makes everyone in the room quietly grateful without saying so. Victor was in the room. He had asked, beforehand, whether she wanted him there, because asking was something he was learning to do with the things that were genuinely her decision, rather than assuming his presence was either wanted or unwanted. She had said yes with the tone of a woman who considered the question reasonable, but the answer obvious, which was its own kind of information. When the doctor placed the child in Victor's arms, he was not prepared. He had told himself he would be. He was a man who prepared for things, who had spent 15 years preparing for things, who had built an entire operational life around the principle that unprepared men did not last. He had held the theoretical weight of this moment in his mind for months and had constructed a version of himself adequate to it. The actual moment had no relationship to the constructed version. The child was small and loud and real in the specific undeniable way of new things present, with a completeness that made everything surrounding her feel slightly provisional by comparison. She was red-faced and unhappy about the immediate world in the way that new people often are, and her face was working through expressions at a rate that suggested the face was testing its own range before settling on a default. She settled briefly, into a look of focused, unfocused attention, the look of someone examining the world from a position of significant uncertainty. And Victor looked at her, and the thing that had been building in his chest across the entire course of the previous 14 months arrived all at once, without warning, and without the decency to be manageable. He did not cry. He was not going to say he cried. His eyes did something, and the room blurred briefly, and he stood very still and let it pass, without performing it or suppressing it, which was a thing he was learning to do with experiences that required it. He looked at Serena. She was watching him. Not the child. She had been watching the child for the last several minutes. She was watching her husband hold their daughter for the first time, and her expression was the most unguarded he had ever seen it. Not without complexity, not without the particular intelligence that lived in everything she did, softer at the surface than the face he had learned, across 14 months of marriage, and one night of crisis, and 14 months of rebuilding. He said quietly, "She looks like you," Serena said. "She looks like herself." Victor looked at the child. "Yes," he said, "she does." Malcolm came to the mansion 6 weeks after the birth. He came alone, without the formation, no black suits, no vehicles arriving in sequence. He came in his own car, parked it himself, and rang the front door like a person visiting rather than an operation executing. Serena opened the door. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. 6 weeks of sleep deprivation, and the particular recalibration of new parenthood had done things to her face that weren't damage. They were more like the evidence of use. The face of someone who had been spending themselves on something real. "You look tired," he said. "You're observant," she said. "Come in." They sat in the library. Victor brought coffee without being asked, which Malcolm registered as data and filed without comment. The child was asleep upstairs, which was a temporary condition that all 3 adults in the room were aware of, and were conducting the conversation around accordingly. Malcolm had come to close accounts. Not financially, the legal and financial settlements had their own track, managed by people whose specific function was to manage them. He had come to close the personal accounting, the kind that existed between people who have been through something that doesn't have a formal resolution process. "Rourke is taking a position in Almeida's network," Malcolm said, "permanently. The others are dispersed, in the way my people disperse. Available if needed, occupied if not. And you?" Serena said. Malcolm looked at his coffee. "I have work," he said. "Kind I've always had. There's no shortage of it." "Is that what you want?" she said. He looked at her. Question had landed in a register he hadn't entirely prepared for. "It's what I do," he said. "That's not what I asked." Malcolm was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had spent considerable time being the person who asked questions of this type, rather than receiving them. And the receiving was not comfortable, and he was not going to pretend it was. "I don't know what I want," he said. "I've been in motion for long enough that stopping looks less like rest and more like falling." "That's an honest answer," Serena said. "You tend to produce those," he said. Victor, who had been sitting back from the conversation with his coffee, said, "The foundation." Malcolm looked at him. "We're building a foundation," Victor said. "The legitimate structure, it's real, it's funded, it's going to be operational within the quarter. We need someone to run the security architecture, not armed perimeter, operational security, financial structures, information protection, risk assessment for the partner organizations." He looked at Malcolm steadily. "It's not what you've been doing. It's adjacent." Malcolm looked at him. "You're offering me a job," he said. "I'm offering you a building project," Victor said, "which is different." Malcolm looked at Serena. She raised both hands in a small gesture that said this was Victor's offer, and she was not managing it in any direction. "I'll consider it," Malcolm said. "That's all I'm asking," Victor said. They drank their coffee and talked about smaller things, the legal proceedings, the appeal timeline, restructuring of the organizational assets that had been part of Victor's cooperation agreement. They talked about Devlin, whose partial cooperation had produced a reduced sentence, and whose name Victor said with a flatness that contained the specific weight of a betrayal he had accepted without fully resolving. Serena watched her husband talk about Devlin and understood that this was the wound that was going to take the longest. Not Marcus. Marcus had been a kind of adversary, a man who had wanted something and had pursued it with a logic. Victor could follow even while finding it reprehensible. Devlin had been something closer, 7 years of morning briefings and security rotations, and the particular intimacy of a man who knows your exits. She didn't say this. Victor knew it. Naming it wasn't what he needed. What he needed was time, and time was the thing she was giving him, by not filling the space where it was supposed to go. Malcolm left in the early afternoon. He paused at the door and looked at Serena. The night of the breach, he said. When I told you the third name. Yes, she said. You had 5 seconds, he said. And then you said, get me to the nursery. And then you handled everything that followed. He paused. I've worked alongside a lot of people in a lot of situations. I want you to know that what you did that night, the whole of it, not just the 5 seconds, is not common. It's not something most people have in them. Serena looked at him. You had 2 of those 5 seconds on the floor of the East Corridor, she said. The night you lost your men in Altman Province. I remember what your face looked like. Malcolm was quiet. It's not special, she said. It's just what people do when the thing they're protecting matters enough. You know that. I know it, he said. I still wanted to say it. She nodded once. He left. The foundation opened in the fall. Not with ceremony. Victor had vetoed ceremony in a way that would have surprised the man he'd been 18 months ago, but that made complete sense to the man he was now. A ceremony was a performance, and performance was something he was retired from. The foundation opened with a staff of 11, a set of programs oriented toward financial literacy and organizational support for small businesses operating in under-resourced communities, and a board of directors that included 2 people whose names would have been impossible in the organization's previous architecture. Serena ran the operations. This was her decision and Victor's agreement, and the product of a conversation that had lasted 3 evenings and had resulted in a structure that gave her full operational authority within the foundation's scope and required his involvement only in decisions that crossed into the financial arrangements that remained under legal monitoring. He had offered more involvement. She had said, I know what I'm doing, Victor. He had said, I know you do. I'm offering because I want to be involved, not because I think you need the help. She had looked at him for a moment with the expression that was becoming, in this second chapter of their marriage, a kind of shorthand between them, the expression that assessed whether a statement was true and, having assessed it, decided what to do with the answer. Then you can come to the Tuesday staff meeting, she had said, and you can manage the external partnership communications because you're better with the formal structures than I am, and you know it. I do know it, he said. Good, she said. Tuesday at 9. He'd been at every Tuesday meeting since. Dante. The evening that settled the remaining question, the one that had been living in the space between them since the night of the breach, waiting for the right moment to be addressed, came on an ordinary night in late November. They were in the library. Serena was working, her laptop open, the Foundation's quarterly report taking shape across the screen. Victor was reading an actual book, which was something he had returned to recently, and which had surprised him with how much of himself he recovered in the practice. The child was asleep upstairs, 6 months old now, and conducting her own operations during daylight hours, with a focus and determination that both parents recognized, and neither mentioned in any way that connected it to genetics, because some observations are private. Serena closed her laptop. Victor looked up from his book. She said, I need to tell you something I didn't tell you before. He put the book down. She looked at him steadily. When Rourke told me Devlin's name when I understood that the contingency was already in motion, I wasn't afraid of the 2 men who came through the South Access, he said. I was afraid, she said, that when you found out Voss had introduced us, that when you had time to sit with it, you were going to decide that the uncertainty was too much, that you couldn't know for certain whether I was who I said I was, and that the not knowing was going to become the thing you held on to instead of everything else. Victor was quiet. I was afraid, she said, that after everything the file, the night, all of it, I was going to lose you to a doubt I couldn't disprove. Because the one thing I couldn't prove to you was the internal truth. I couldn't prove what I felt when I met you. I couldn't prove that the choice to stay and build the file was mine and not Voss's design. I could provide evidence of everything external, and the one thing that actually mattered was the thing that doesn't have documentation. Victor looked at her. The library was very quiet. He said, I know. You know I was afraid? I know the rest, he said. I know the choice was yours. I know what you felt was real. He held her gaze. Not because I have evidence. Because I watched you for 14 months, and I watched you for one night. That was the equivalent of years of information, and I know who you are. I know how you move through a situation. I know the difference between someone executing a plan and someone making choices. He paused. You make choices. All of them yours. That's not something anyone designed. Serena looked at him. The expression on her face was not the assessed, measured expression he had learned across their time together. It was something underneath that the thing, the assessed expression, had been protecting, which was less composed and more real, and which she was, in this moment, not pulling back from. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. I needed to hear it, she said. I know I'm not someone who usually needs. She stopped, started again. I've been carrying it since that night. Whether you were going to land on certainty or whether the doubt was going to live in it forever, I needed to know which way you'd landed. Certainty, he said, months ago. I know, she said. I know you didn't say it because you didn't know I needed it. I should have known, he said. You're learning, she said, not as absolution, as fact. Yes, he said, I am. She looked at him with the smile that was small and real and slightly tired, the smile he had first seen in the library, on the night of the breach, in the hours before dawn, when she had told him the window was open and he had knocked. He got up from his chair. He crossed to the sofa where she was sitting. He sat beside her. She leaned. He put his arm around her, carefully and without theater, the way a person holds something they understand the value of, not tightly, not with the grip of possession, but with the steady weight of someone who has decided to be present and means it. She leaned a little more. Outside the library window, the November dark was the ordinary dark of a quiet night, no crisis in it, no architecture of threat, just the dark that comes at the end of a day and means nothing except that the day has ended. They sat in it. 6 months after the foundation opened, Malcolm Creed took the position Victor had offered. He did not announce this. He appeared on a Tuesday at 9 in the morning with a cup of coffee and sat in the staff meeting and asked 4 questions about the existing security architecture that demonstrated he had done more preparation than the offer required. And when the meeting ended, he spoke briefly with Serena, and then with Victor, and the transition was, to the observation of the staff present, perfectly unremarkable. Rourke came for the Foundation's first public event, a small community program launch, not large, not covered by any press that mattered. Came in his own clothes, not a suit, and stood near the back of the room and watched with the expression of a man who has attended many events of many kinds and has preferences about which kind he prefers. After the event, he found Serena near the exit. You did good, he said. We did, she said. He nodded at Victor, who was across the room talking to 2 of the program directors, with the particular focused attention of a man who is genuinely interested in what he's hearing. He's different, Rourke said. Yes, Serena said. She looked at her husband across the room. At the man who had grabbed her wrist on a staircase, and the man who had sat on a corridor floor, and the man who was now asking a program director a follow-up question that indicated he had been listening to the answer. He's who he was going to be, she said. He just took longer to get there than he needed to. Rourke considered this. You knew that, he said. From the beginning. Quiet for a moment. I hoped it, she said. There's a difference. He nodded. They stood in the room and watched Victor Rains listen to a program director explain the needs of the community the Foundation was serving, and the man who had spent 15 years making people afraid was leaning forward slightly, asking a follow-up question, taking in an answer he hadn't anticipated, and visibly revising something in response to it. Learning. Still learning. That was in the end what she had hoped for, and what had turned out to be true, and what was going to be true tomorrow, and the day after. Not perfection, not the resolved and finished version of a man, but the ongoing version, the one that was still in the process of becoming. She had spent her professional life understanding risk. She understood that the ongoing version, the still becoming, was the only version worth sitting for. She stayed.